Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ashen Souls, Fallen Hearts in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Poesruit. In a word, Ferdinand von Aegir was unsettled. Even admitting that felt like the greatest understatement he had ever made. The last few days had been well beyond confusion, and Ferdinand practically hadn't stopped thinking about everything odd that had taken place. First, the Black Eagles had set out to save Monica, though they hadn't entirely known what they were getting into until it was too late to pull back, not that they would have in the first place. Afterward, Tamash had been exposed as a traitor to the church and fled the monastery, revealing a long-standing hatred for the teachings of Siros despite his even longer servitude at Gareg Mach. And now, half of the Black Eagles had left the monastery behind to investigate something else outside the scope of the officers' academy. Edelgard hadn't said much of anything before she left. She had taken Hubert, Dorothea, Petra, Monica, and Shay before setting off, leaving Ferdinand at the monastery with Caspar, Linhard, and Bernadetta. He had only heard about his house leader leaving second-hand from the Blue Lions, who had heard the details from Catherine. To say that Ferdinand was frustrated with the lack of information being passed his way was once again a dramatic simplification of his thoughts, but there was little he could do to fix it. And strangely enough, Ferdinand appeared to be the only one who cared at all about fixing the circumstances or trying to learn the truth behind all of this. Caspar had taken advantage of this extra time to try and train under the hope that he would finally catch up to Juritzau by the time the professor returned from the impromptu trip away from Gareg Mach. Linhard was sleeping more than ever, completely apathetic to Ferdinand's plight. Bernadetta hadn't left her room at all since hearing she was free from classes for the next few days, so Ferdinand was the only one in the Black Eagles classroom. But he couldn't just sit there with the weight of his own confusion. He was tired of going through the same old circles with his concerned thoughts, and he needed to try and get his lingering worries out of his head and out into the world where someone could provide feedback on them. That was how he wound up summoning the rest of his classmates to the Black Eagles room, and he paced the length of the classroom near the chalkboard. Caspar was still holding a training axe, and his cheek bore a particularly nasty bruise from his over-the-top dedication to improving his skills. He had never been the best when it came to self-preservation, and it showed plainly on his face. "Ferdinand, why did you want to see us?" Caspar asked. He maneuvered the wooden axe in his hand, examining it for a few seconds before looking back up to Ferdinand. Technically, the students weren't supposed to have any weapons in the classroom, but as long as there was no professor to get them in trouble, Caspar was able to get away with it easily. That was another matter entirely. Juritzau had left as well without any explanation, seemingly preoccupied with whatever it was that Edelgard needed done, to the point that it outclassed his actual job at the monastery as a professor. "And would you stop pacing?" Linhard questioned with a light sting to his tone. He was sitting in his regular seat with his head propped up against one hand as he watched Ferdinand continue to pace. "You're tiring me out, and I'm not even the one pacing." Ferdinand stopped walking to take a small breath as he addressed his classmates. "Don't you find it odd?" he inquired in place of a full answer. "Edelgard and the rest of our classmates have left for some reason, but they never elaborated on why. They simply left us behind, and we don't know where they are or what they're trying to do right now. They must have some good reason for it. I think we both know Edelgard wouldn't do something like this without strong logic," Linhard pointed out. "Why can't we just trust that she knows what to do with this? Whatever it is, she has it under control." "But she didn't tell us what she was doing, and she left without explaining anything," Ferdinand countered. "Why would she do that? Why would she want to keep so many of us out of the loop? I understand that she would not act without reason, but I have to wonder just what reasoning is pushing her forward." "Then what do you expect us to do about it?" Caspar inquired with a raise of one eyebrow. "We don't really have a way to contact her and make her tell us what she's been getting up to. We can ask around the monastery all we want, but the people here probably won't be able to help." Ferdinand hesitated at that. He admittedly hadn't thought that far ahead, though that was mostly because Edelgard was much better at keeping secrets than he had anticipated. He had tried to find the truth behind her recent secrecy, but he hadn't made much progress before running into brick wall after brick wall. That was why he had asked to see the rest of his classmates. He had been hoping they would be able to offer him at least one piece of advice when it came to filling in the gaps behind Edelgard's recent odd behavior, but it was becoming steadily apparent that this would not be the case. Ferdinand took in a slow breath before looking to the rest of his classmates. Caspar was the only one watching him at this point, since Linhard was on the verge of drifting off to sleep again and Bernadetta was hiding in the corner because she had been dragged out of her room unwillingly. Ferdinand clapped his hands together to forcefully acquire the attention of the other two before he spoke. "I want to follow Edelgard to wherever she has gone now," he announced. "That should give us the answers we need." "We don't even know where she is," Linhard reminded him, not even bothering to open his eyes beyond half-mast. "We can't exactly find her and make her talk if we don't know where to look in the first place. Unless you know where we should be searching." Ferdinand faltered for another moment before shaking his head. "You must have noticed the monastery emptying out a lot over the course of the last few days, yes?" he questioned. "A bunch of the Knights of Syros you would normally see around here aren't in the area anymore. I have to wonder if perhaps they have anything to do with where the rest of them went. I somehow doubt this is just a coincidence. Can't you go and bother the other knights then instead of pestering us about this?" Bernadetta asked miserably. "I don't care what everybody else is up to right now. They know what they're doing, and I'm not going to get involved with it unless I have to. I tried to ask questions about it, but I didn't receive anything that could help me find them," Ferdinand replied with a shake of his head. "But if we all work together, then maybe we can push them to answer our questions. We just have to find someone who would be able to tell us about Edelgard, and after that, we can follow her." "I still don't see why this is necessary," Linhard told him. "The others know how to take care of themselves, and if you're really so curious, then you can do it on your own. Just leave the rest of us out of it." Ferdinand let out a small sigh. "I'm sure you'll be interested in joining me when I figure out more about all of this," he murmured. He didn't want to follow Edelgard on his own, especially when he didn't know what sort of danger she could have wound up charging into. It was a risk he couldn't bring himself to take, not when he understood so little. He just had to find some way to get the others to come along. After a few beats of contemplation, Ferdinand started toward the door. "I'll find out why all of this started, and I'll tell you as soon as I can," he announced. If the others refused to help him, then he would simply take matters into his own hands. Maybe he just hadn't been searching hard enough when he hadn't learned anything previously. He had to try harder. That was all. Linhard watched Ferdinand walk out before allowing his cheek to slide against the desk before him. "I don't know what makes him think things are going to be any different now, but I guess there's no stopping him now," he muttered under his breath. "Whatever makes him happy." A moment later, he was back to the world of dreams, snoring lightly. Caspar and Bernadetta shared a glance, and the former shrugged before heading back to the training hall. Bernadetta just opened the book she had brought with her and started to read, burying her nose in the pages like she thought the volume might swallow her if she wished hard enough. Whatever Ferdinand and Edelgard did was none of her business, and she really hoped it stayed that way. Please let it stay that way. Volkhard von Arundel was a busy man, and he made sure everyone knew it. Running the empire was not an easy task. Ever since he had become regent, every day had been filled with activity and buzz. The Adrestian Empire was far from its previous strength, and his job was to restore the nation to its full potential. The empire could have been powerful, it simply needed nurturing, and he was more than happy to do that. Unfortunately, the goddess from wherever hell she lived in didn't seem to want that for him today. Arundel stood in the castle of Inver with his fists clenched tight and more rage boiling in his stomach than he had seen in a long time. "What?" he questioned of the man before him. The messenger wore all black robes and a mask that resembled a bird, a pattern all too familiar to Arundel even though he wanted nothing to do with it today. Everything would have been a lot simpler if there was no reason for the man to be there in the first place. "Solon has been rooted out of the monastery," the messenger repeated. "The church unmasked him after the Oaks girl escaped." Arundel groaned to himself, letting one hand come up to rub at his temple. He could already feel a headache coming on, and the conversation had only just begun. First Cronia's debacle, and now this, he muttered crossly. He had thought everything was running smoothly. In fact, the entire plan had lined up perfectly for the last few months. All of that had come crashing down though, and to say that Arundel was frustrated was an understatement. This was perhaps the worst-case scenario, and he didn't even know the full extent of the damage yet. What are we to do? The messenger questioned. There was an edgy anxiety to his words that only grated on Arendel's nerves more, but the regent refused to let it show. Instead, Arundel just pressed his shoulders back in a show of strength he didn't entirely believe. Keep our composure, for a start, he began. Send word to the kingdom and see that Cleobulus is informed of all that has happened. Tell her to remain prudent. If she must go into hiding or otherwise advance her plans, so be it. At once, my lord, the messenger said with a bow. The man went to leave, but he was cut off by a sharp knock at the door, and he exchanged a brief glance with his lord. The man was worried behind his mask, but the bird shape kept the depth of his concern hidden. Yes? Arundel questioned, doing his best to maintain the calmness of his tone despite the overwhelming urge to shatter something as soon as he could. A soldier entered a moment later, his armor the signature crimson of the Imperial Army. Lord Regent. I have urgent tidings to report. Arundel arched an eyebrow as the man came to a stop in front of him. The soldier was thoroughly flustered, and it took him a moment to catch his breath enough to speak again. Forgive the intrusion, my lord, but we just learned that the Knights of Syros are marching on Inver as we speak. Their purpose is unclear, but they will arrive by morning. The man with the bird mask turned to Arundel, his voice muted with terror. The Knights of Syros? No. You don't think? Arundel snarled under his breath. There's only one person who could be behind it, he whispered with rage. How dare she? He took a moment to compose himself before looking to the soldier, his eyes colder than ever before. They may already be within the palace walls if they are as close as you claim. Mobilize the guards and search every inch of the castle. If anyone so much as ignores a single order, kill them on the spot. The Imperial soldier nodded before retreating from the room, and the messenger turned to face Arundel once again. Unfortunate. I had been hoping we wouldn't run into any other issues after the incident with Cronia, the man murmured. If she wishes to continue causing issues, then so be it. There are no more excuses for her now. The instant she shows herself, take her head. She made her decision, and we must make ours, Arundel announced. He started toward the door, turning to look at the messenger over his shoulder. Prepare for battle? The messenger simply nodded. Of course. Elsewhere in the palace, another battle began to stir. Waldemar von Hevering and Leopold von Berglis stood together at one of the windows in the Inver castle. They overlooked the rest of the city below, watching as the Knights of Syros surged ever forward toward the palace. It would only be a matter of minutes before a battle broke out in full, and they could see it. This is moving rather quickly, wouldn't you say? Waldemar murmured softly. I was under the impression we would be negotiating the details of the war for another few months. The situation must have changed, Leopold said simply. She wouldn't do this without good reason. All we have to do is follow our orders. I admire how strong she's become already. I wish we'd been given more time to appraise her competence, Waldemar confessed. He looked to the clock on the wall even though that was far from marking the time he was thinking about. If she's caught us off guard, just imagine how they feel, Leopold snorted. I can't wait to see the look on their faces. Oh, I'm going to enjoy every second of this. He reached for his gauntlets where they rested on the nearby table, testing the weight and feel of the steel by punching at the air twice. Waldemar rolled his eyes loosely before grabbing at a tome sitting next to where the gauntlets had been. As if you'd be content to only watch. Once the battle starts, you'll be knee-deep in gore with all the rest, he muttered. I can only hope she planned this carefully enough to not tear apart the nation entirely. As if she would let the empire splinter that easily, Leopold countered. Though we won't know for sure until we win this battle. Now, let's see if you can keep up with me. He shot Waldemar a competitive smile and started for the door. Waldemar just rolled his eyes again. Oh, please, he whispered. He gripped his tome a bit tighter before following Leopold out, closing the door behind him, and with it came the closure on every plan they had ever made. Times were changing, and they had to do the same whether they liked it or not. Shay was still confused and drained by the time morning arrived, and she gripped tightly at the hilt of her sword as she and the rest of the Black Eagles followed Edelgard out from their camp and into the capital. As Edelgard had said, the Knights of Syros were there to do damage control, and the troops spread out around the city to try and keep the people calm for as long as possible. Shay should have been happy to know that the occupants of the Empire would be kept safe from whatever they were fighting against, but instead, the mere idea of the Knights of Syros being there made her stomach sink into her feet. Edelgard only stopped walking when the group had arrived just outside one of the side entrances of the castle. There was no ceremony or gravitas with their arrival, and the building was shockingly unguarded from this one angle. Shay knew that had to be intentional. All of this was building up to an attack on the palace, though the mercenary still couldn't figure out for the life of her why Edelgard would want to lead an assault on the place she called home. The battle is at hand, everyone, Edelgard declared. Now that the group was on the cusp of their first attack, she couldn't hold the secret in any longer, and every member of the group listened intently and anxiously for the truth. Back at the monastery, Tamash revealed himself to be a member of a group of dark and powerful mages. Members of that same group are here in the capital of the Empire, and they have taken control of House Hresvelg from the inside. What are we going to do about it then? Shay questioned as she looked up to the castle. I don't understand how we're supposed to get rid of them when we barely even know who or what we're fighting against. We are targeting a few important people within the palace, and if we can defeat them, then we can free the Empire from its corruption, Edelgard went on. My father, the Emperor, has been made into a puppet at the hands of these dark mages. They plot with disloyal subjects to seize control of the Empire. We stand here today to stamp these traitors out, seize the palace, and reclaim the Empire for our own. Dorothea looked nervously at Shay before turning her attention back to Edelgard. You realize it's just us, right, Edie? She asked, her voice frail. That sounds kind of impossible. The Empire is having many soldiers, Petra pointed out. Perhaps we could be changing their minds and convincing them to fight alongside us. Those who can be won over will be. And the realization they are fighting the Imperial Princess ought to dull the others' blades, Hubert said. We have also secured the cooperation of several nobles inside the palace. Very impressive, Your Highness. And very you, Monica remarked with a small smile. I suppose all that remains is to head inside and take care of business. First, I'd like to know who exactly we're fighting against, Dorothea chimed in. We can't really do much if we barely know who we're supposed to target in the first place. The first of our two primary targets is my uncle and the regent of the Empire, Volkhard von Arundel. Afterward, we turn our attention to Ludwig von Aegir, the Prime Minister, Edelgard explained. They had little warning of our attack, so we should be able to catch them off guard and dispose of them quickly and easily. Shay nodded, trying to seem more confident than she felt. You've got it. No matter what, I'll be there, she assured Edelgard. Here we are, ready to deal a master stroke to the heart of the mighty Empire, Arvel murmured. And with the end of the battle, we should be able to learn something about that magic Tamash has and how it connects to our powers. At least one of those two men must have something to do with our abilities. Though I never thought the answers would lie in the regent of the Empire or Ferdinand's father of all people. I can certainly see why Edelgard wanted to leave him behind. We'll start by infiltrating the palace through the rear gate. Then, we apprehend Lord Arundel and Duke Aegir. From there, we'll secure the palace's strategic positions, eliminating all resistance we encounter along the way and defeating any soldiers who continue to stand against us. Petra nodded. If that is our plan, then time cannot be wasted. You can practically hear them scrambling in the palace from here, Dorothea murmured. Let's not wait for them to find their bearings. She reached for her tome, though she did a poor job of hiding the way her hands shook all the while. Lead the way, Your Highness. Monica declared, a bright smile on her face. For someone who had been held captive so recently, she was surprisingly optimistic, though Shay could only assume that was what happened when someone set their sights on revenge. They won't know what hit them until it's far too late, Hubert smirked to himself. These villains have had free run of my house for far too long, Edelgard declared. She pointed her axe forward, and the group pushed through the doors leading into the castle. Today, I take it all back. Searching for answers took a lot less time than Ferdinand had anticipated. In the days since Edelgard had left, anxiety had started to rise among the Knights of Syros no matter how desperate the remaining fighters were to hide it. Nobody seemed to know the full story, but Ferdinand was able to hear enough from asking around the monastery for those who were the most caught up in their own concern. There was only one thing he needed to know, and as soon as he heard it, he started back toward the Black Eagle's classroom. Linhard was still at his desk the same as before, snoozing away with his head pressed against one arm. Caspar was taking a break from his training, and he leaned against his own desk while taking a mighty drink of water. Bernadetta's gaze had remained locked on her book all this time, and she went to turn to the next page with her fingers fiddling with the paper. Ferdinand slammed the doors open. "I've found it." Linhard shot awake, coughing when he jolted a bit too quickly. Bernadetta squealed, and her anxious fingers pulled downward on instinct, tearing the page of her book ever so slightly. She let out a miserable whimper as she glanced up to Ferdinand in fearful upset. "Did you have to be so loud?" she groaned. "What exactly did you find?" Caspar asked. He thought about it for a moment before nodding. "That's right. You were trying to figure out what happened with Edelgard and the rest of our class, right?" "They left for Inver," Ferdinand announced. "The Knights of Syros went with them. I can't think of any reason the Knights of Syros would have gone with Edelgard aside from her preparing for a fight. As we speak, the capital is under attack, and she left us behind instead of bringing us along. Isn't that a good thing?" Bernadetta questioned. "I don't know why anyone would want to be involved in a big fight like that. I'm more than happy just sitting here and reading my book. That's all the activity I need for the next week, as a matter of fact." "But our families are probably in Inver right now," Ferdinand pressed. "They could be in danger, and we weren't meant to know about it at all. I cannot just stand back as long as I know harm could be coming to my father. I need to go and investigate this at once." The mention of their families was enough to get Linhard and Caspar interested at last. "If there's a fight in the capital right now, I bet my father's involved with it," Caspar agreed. He set his training axe down, leaning the wooden against the table, before nodding in Ferdinand's direction. "All right. If you're going to check this out, then so am I." Linhard glanced back and forth between the two. He let out a long-suffering sigh and shook his head. "I have a bad feeling about this," he muttered, though he said nothing that would imply an objection. In fact, he pushed himself to his feet and stretched his arms high above his head, pulling the exhaustion from his weary body in the process. The remaining 3 Black Eagles all looked to Bernadetta next, and the purple-haired girl forced herself to meet their gazes. She seemed tempted to just go back to reading her book, to ignore all of this, but she couldn't push them away forever. She clapped her book shut with another groan and pushed herself to her feet. "Fine," she exclaimed sharply. "Just remember that I told you this was a bad idea from the start. Don't forget that I knew this was going to end poorly when it does." None of the other 3 Black Eagles paid much heed to Bernadetta's complaints as they gathered their things for the journey ahead. They were a few days behind Edelgard, but if the battle was about to begin, then they may have had the time they needed to catch up. They didn't need to march with an entire army of knights in order to reach their destination, after all. If they were fast, they would arrive soon enough without any issues. In Inver, the beginnings of a battle raged. The rest of the Black Eagles would see the truth soon enough. Dmitri didn't know what this was about. It was rare for any individual student to receive a summons to speak with Rhea. The Archbishop was a busy woman, always caught up in some meeting or another to ensure the monastery and continent were running smoothly. She didn't have time for individual conversations with monastery occupants regardless of how important they were to the rest of the world. Rhea was the most important person in the monastery, and she had other things to do. And that was why Dmitri was so completely baffled that he had been asked to speak with her at all. The Blue Lions had been going about their regular business with classes for the day when a knight arrived to escort him to Syria. Dmitri had been allowed to leave without much of a fuss, and so, he started the walk up to the audience chamber. His mind couldn't stop spinning with the idea of what he was going to hear. The last few weeks had been hectic at best between Monica being recovered from the grasp of those strange mages and then half of the Knights of Syros leaving with Edelgard to march on Inver. Dmitri somehow doubted Rhea was going to ask him to sit down for a tea party with her, so that begged the question, what was all of this about? Dmitri knocked on the door to the audience chamber once he arrived outside the room, taking in a small breath to ensure he seemed composed. Somehow, being left alone with his own thoughts about why Rhea wanted to speak with him was worse than the idea that he had been summoned at all. As soon as he received the word to enter, he gladly did so, closing the door behind himself with a gentle tap. "You wished to see me, Lady Rhea?" Dmitri asked. He glanced up and was met with the sight of Rhea and Seath speaking with one another in hushed, intense tones. They glanced over in his direction after hearing his voice, and Seath's eyes met the floor in a stony glare. "I did," Rhea confirmed. She hesitated for a moment, struggling to find the best way to word what she was about to say. "I have received word of something happening in Fhirdiad, and I am afraid the tidings are far from good." Dmitri felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "What happened?" he questioned, trying to hide just how afraid of the answer he really was. "Your uncle has seized control of the capital," Seath replied, his eyes falling shut. "He has declared war against House Frildarius and intends to take control of the throne by force." Dmitri's eyes went wide, and despite his best attempts to speak, he couldn't force the words out. Rhea was happy to fill the silence, and she continued. "Duke Frildarius is set to arrive soon. The attack was sudden and came without warning, but Duke Frildarius managed to escape the chaos to come here." Dmitri nodded to himself. He preferred to have Rodrigue there with him than fighting on his own if his uncle truly had declared war, though he hated how it had come to this so suddenly. Dmitri would have been lying if he said he hadn't seen this coming to some degree, but that didn't change how twisted the betrayal was or how much it made his stomach churn. It all felt too awful to be real between the attack on Inver and the sudden coup in the Feyergon capital. The last few weeks had been hectic enough as it was, but this only made things worse. Dmitri had no idea how anyone was meant to grapple with this at all, much less all at once. However, he knew what had to be done. He hated that it had come to this, but he knew there was no other option. Such was the way of his position whether he liked it or not. After a few moments of thought, Dmitri looked up to Rhea and Seath. "There is only one thing to be done then," he declared. "We must take Fhirdiad back from him. No matter what it takes." Chapter 12, Rot at the Root. Sneaking in through the back entrance of the castle was, as it turned out, a rather simple affair. Nobody even thought of stopping Edelgard's forces, and Shay was beyond glad for it. The simpler this fight was, the better off all of them would be. Shay was starting to understand why Edelgard wanted her to come back to the Empire with her after they graduated from the Officers' Academy though, if they had been able to sneak into the castle so easily, Edelgard was no doubt concerned about security. Shay was too, and she had next to nothing to do with the Empire outside of her affiliation in the Black Eagle House. Slipping in was almost comically easy. "The knight's unexpected visit must have thrown the court into disarray," Monica remarked, though she didn't allow herself to drop her guard for long as she scanned the room for any signs of activity. "In that case, we'd best find and apprehend Duke Aegir and Lord Arundel before they grow wise to our scheme," Edelgard announced. "Duke Aegir should be in the throne room. We'll enter through the back way and take him by surprise," Hubert went on. Everyone else offered small nods, and Hubert glanced up. A few guards were finally starting to make themselves known, though he didn't seem bothered by this at all. Instead, he just laughed to himself. "These guards are in Duke Aegir's personal employ. Deal with them as you must." That was all Shay needed to hear, and she surged forward with her sword at the ready a moment later. She struck down the first few soldiers that tried to come after her before deflecting yet another blow. The guards were rattled, and it showed in the way they were fighting. If they had been fighting at their full strength, then this would have been a very different battle. Luckily, it was mostly a cakewalk for Shay to push through the first wave, and everyone else agreed. The Black Eagles ran into no issues with fending off the first wave, and any lingering traces of worry or a lack of confidence quickly evaporated with the revelation that they had survived the initial onslaught. If they had gotten that far, then they would be fine. Or, at the very least, that was the hope. Following the initial attack, there was a gap where no soldiers tried to attack the Black Eagles, so Edelgard took this chance to lead her forces forward into the castle and in the direction of the throne room. Shay knew this was no time for admiring the scenery, but she couldn't help staring at the castle around her along the way. She had never been inside a castle for obvious reasons, but she was starting to see just how much she had been missing out on all those years. After this fight was over, she was going to have to take a more in-depth look around the palace of Inver just for the sake of her own curiosity. The Black Eagles arrived at the entrance to the throne room just as a second wave of attackers was converging on them, but Monica and Hubert were quick to open a path to the front room regardless. They created twin blasts of magic that carved open the enemy soldiers just enough to reveal the group's first target. Duke Ludwig von Aegir was standing in the throne room, his hands shaking and his eyes wide from terror as he realized just what was happening. Edelgard's plan of taking the enemy by surprise was working, and Ludwig was living proof. "Surrender, Duke Aegir," Edelgard announced. She was the only one who wasn't charging into combat at this point, with the rest of the Black Eagles defending her as she made her threats to their first opponent. Her axe seemed a little bit sharper as she stood there watching Ludwig, waiting to see what he was going to do first. Ludwig refused to back down though, and he turned to a handful of his soldiers with terror in his eyes. "Seal the gate," he declared. A few of the guards hesitated at the sight of Edelgard and her personal guard, but Ludwig slammed the bottom of his comically oversized shield into the ground to spur them into action. Now, half of the guards rushed toward the Black Eagles where they stood at the back entrance of the throne room, and that was enough of a distraction for another of Ludwig's guards to concentrate his attention on closing the door and sealing off the gate. Ludwig stared at his attackers for a few seconds, struggling to bring himself to move as his fear fully sunk in. Once he had seen enough, he turned on his heel and started to run away, his shield dragging on the ground along the way. "That complicates things," Dorothea murmured. She looked over in Edelgard's direction when she found a lull in the fight, sending out a blast of fire to fend off a handful of guards. "What should we do, Edie?" "We can cut through the gardens to reach the other entrance. We can corner him before he has the chance to escape," Edelgard replied. "Come on." She took off running a moment later, and the rest of the Black Eagles followed her. Shay distantly heard Ludwig speaking once again, his voice desperate and loud above the crowd. "Put every guard between me and that girl. Block off the gardens too," he cried out. Shay winced, trying to not think about how his voice felt like 1,000 tiny needles being driven directly into her skull. "I have to wonder how the Empire survived for so long with someone like this as its prime minister," Arvel muttered in complete bewilderment. "Though I suppose it won't survive for much longer now that we're here. Even if he wasn't related to our powers, I would be fine with fighting him given what we've seen of him thus far. What a coward." Shay slashed her blades downward and pushed back a final trio of guards rushing in her direction, and Petra followed up to eliminate the other fighters attacking her. The two shared a brief nod and a smile before they continued onward, following Edelgard's command of heading to the gardens. Edelgard was their front-line fighter, and Hubert, Monica, and Dorothea were following her from behind to keep out of the line of fire while still dealing massive damage to those who were trying to get around Edelgard. Shay and Petra covered their tracks until they were confident nobody was going to follow them, and from there, they surged forward to join Edelgard at the front of the party, blades at the ready. Once again, Shay had to admit the palace was beyond impressive. It was a shame to see the ground stained with so much blood because of people who shouldn't have been in the castle at all. As long as this was the way the battle was flowing though, Shay was happy to push back against it. Ludwig's forces weren't particularly strong to begin with, so she found herself with surprisingly few issues as she pushed through to the gardens. As soon as the Black Eagles broke free of the onslaught to the outside of the castle, Shay winced. The grandiose hallways of the Inver Palace had given way to gardens that were even more open, leaving all the space in the world for Ludwig's personal guard to rush toward them. The soldiers were caught off guard, and Shay could only assume most of them had come from the bulk of the city to investigate the scuffle at the castle, especially since the Knights of Syros were rushing through the streets. In other words, the Black Eagles were going to have to change up their strategy if they were going to push through this onslaught because of the sheer numbers the enemy had at their disposal. Shay rushed forward and cut at the first few soldiers that threatened to attack her classmates, and she pushed them back with relative ease. The guards were disoriented at best and lawless at worst, and with Ludwig too busy running with his tail between his legs, there was no one to command or lead them. They were fighting with no sense of direction, and even if they had been the best army in the world, Anshe could certainly say they were not, that would have been enough to knock them down a few pegs. As things stood though, Shay found herself walking through the battlefield with comedic ease, and when the gardens transformed into a battlefield, she was ready for it. Hubert sent out an explosion of dark magic, and Shay rushed toward the soldiers that had been knocked prone to cut them down. Hubert offered a loose hum of what Shay could only assume was approval, though it was hard to say for sure how he felt about anything aside from Edelgard. Shay took this to mean something good though, and she used it as an extra bit of motivation to push herself onward. Dorothea concentrated her attention on attacking the soldiers away from the greenery to ensure she didn't accidentally catch anything on fire in the process, and Petra finished off the guards she pushed backward. Dorothea glanced over in Edelgard's direction with a frown as soon as she had the chance, concern filling her eyes at breakneck speeds. "Edie? I'm sorry if this is invasive, but what exactly is stopping him from running away?" she questioned. "Couldn't he just run now that we're away from the throne room?" "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that," Edelgard assured her. "Let's just say that I gathered a few allies in advance, and it's about time for them to prove where their loyalties lie." She smiled to herself, revealing that same charming and relaxing grin Shay had found so intriguing even back when they first met. To say that Dorothea was confused was a grand understatement, but she did her best to hide it. She just nodded, choosing to have faith in the reinforcements Edelgard was calling in as she summoned another flare of fire magic. Monica followed that up with a blast of magic from her specialized tome, and Shay stared at it for a few seconds when she had the chance. Something about the weapon felt familiar to her, though she couldn't quite put a finger on it. Shay's body moved without her permission soon afterward, and she rolled close to the ground before coming up and slashing her blade toward the sky. Arvel groaned from the back of Shay's head. "You need to pay more attention," they reminded her. "No matter how sad these guards are, we can't afford to lose focus now." Shay nodded, though she couldn't hold back her curiosity when it came to Monica's tome. She would have to think about it more after the fight ended to ensure she didn't lose her head while she was thinking of how interesting the weapon looked, but Shay was going to investigate it eventually. Why in the world would a random tome feel familiar to her? She had never seen a weapon like that before, and yet, there she was, strangely drawn to the sight of Monica's tome like it was actively trying to get her attention. "I don't know," Arvel said simply. "I have no idea why that tome would strike you as so familiar, but it doesn't matter much right now. If we want to hear about it, then we can ask Monica after the fight ends. I don't want you to end up losing your head because of your inattention." "Understood." She nodded again, and she deliberately averted her focus from Monica for a short while to cut down the other guards rushing in her direction. She couldn't help wondering what Edelgard had been referring to when she said there were reinforcements in the castle waiting to show their loyalty. As far as Shay was concerned, the outbreak of a battle was a pretty damn good time to make themselves known. Where in the world were they? Chaos overtook the castle quickly after Edelgard and the Black Eagles attacked from the back. The soldiers were in such complete disarray that nobody even thought of giving Leopold or Waldemar a second glance as they navigated through the palace. The guards scrambled freely, but none of them asked for help from the ministers. It was difficult to say if they were being cagey and avoidant of the idea because of some interference from Ludwig or if they truly were that stubborn and ignorant to their circumstances, but it mattered little. As long as the fight ended the way they had hoped, all would be well. Leopold stood in a hallway near the front entrance to the gardens, his gauntlets at the ready and his eyes narrowed in determination. All he needed now was to hear Edelgard's secondary signal to show that she had arrived at the castle and was ready for him to obscure Ludwig's escape. After that, everything would fall into place, and the first step of Inber's reclamation would finally be complete. Edelgard and the rest of the Black Eagles carved through the rest of the gardens easily, pushing back the soldiers in their clueless dazes. It was almost impressive how little effort they had to put in because of the confusion that had swept through the castle like a tidal wave. Leopold kept an eye on Edelgard to the best of his ability, not stepping out from his hiding place but still doing what he could to watch her. They didn't know how soon Ludwig would try to escape, and he had to be ready for anything. A few guards started moving toward the gardens from the heart of the castle, and Edelgard cut down a soldier that dared to approach her. "Count Berglis, now!" she declared. Leopold stepped out into the open with that, punching hard and fast at the first few soldiers that appeared before him. The guards were too surprised to do much more than stand there and take the hits, and Leopold had to admit that he was disappointed. He had been hoping Ludwig's soldiers would put up more of a fight. Then again, that had probably been his first mistake. Ludwig's personal guard was hardly the strongest in Inver, much less in the Empire as a whole, and him being clumsy and disoriented was only making it worse. It was almost said how easy this battle was turning out to be. Nearby, the rest of the Black Eagles glanced over at Edelgard in surprise at the implication that she had managed to secure an alliance with Leopold von Berglis of all people. He was easily one of the strongest fighters in the entirety of Fodlan, and there he was, fighting with the Black Eagles without any objections. Edelgard and Hubert were the only ones who didn't seem surprised at all, and they gladly led the charge while the others caught their breath and pushed away their confusion. "You won over Count Berglis to help you?" Monica questioned. She was the only one bold enough to put her surprise to words, and she looked to Edelgard with wide, shocked eyes. "Where did you find the time to orchestrate that?" Edelgard offered no response, instead just pointing her axe ahead and following it forward to cut down a soldier that had managed to slip past Leopold to attack her. "Duke Agir is in the throne room. We're closer than ever now. Come on." She took off before anyone could ask about why she was being so vague, and the Black Eagles had no other choice but to follow her onward. Shay offered a glance in Leopold's direction as she walked past him, and she couldn't help staring even if it was only for the briefest of moments. There was a man she could admire for his raw strength. She had heard of him being the strongest fighter in the Empire, and seeing him fight, she could certainly believe it. After the battle was over, maybe she would be able to talk to him and see if he had any tips to offer. "The key word there is after the battle, Shay," Arvel reminded her. "Come on. It seems our first windbag of the day is in the throne room still." With Leopold acting as such a bold distraction, the Black Eagles continued to charge through the castle with the throne room as their target. Shay ran as quickly as she could, slashing at any soldier that dared to stand in her way. Soon enough, the hallways started to morph into something familiar again, and she realized they were almost back at the throne room. In other words, the first important step of the battle was about to begin. But before Shay could fully focus on fighting Ludwig, another man appeared in her path. Waldemar von Hevering had a tome in one hand, and he stood in the entryway to the throne room. Even though he clearly lacked the combat experience Leopold was known for, Shay knew better than to overstep her boundaries with him. Even just a first glance told her that he had to be Linhard's father, and that meant he was probably there to help them out. He was just the extra distraction the group was going to need. "I will give you a chance to lay down your arms peacefully," Waldemar began as he took a step toward Ludwig. Shay and the other Black Eagles fell into position around him, their weapons at the ready. If Ludwig knew what was good for him, then he would have just surrendered then and there, though Shay somehow doubted that would be what happened. Ludwig was too stubborn for his own good, and he was going to try and fight to the bitter end no matter what that meant for him. "Why are you doing this?" Ludwig roared. "We've worked together for years, and you would stab me in the back now. What do you stand to gain? What could anyone gain from having such a sniveling fool in power?" Hubert countered. "Besides, I believe each and every one of us knows exactly where we stand and why. What you do with that information is your decision." Ludwig snarled and looked at the Black Eagles again. Edelgard took one more step forward and pointed her axe at him. Even with a massive entourage of soldiers surrounding him on all sides, he looked small and weak, unable to put up a fight unless it was a battle of who could seem the most important without substance. Edelgard's eyes narrowed. "This is your last chance. Surrender or suffer the consequences," she instructed. "You're still outnumbered. This isn't over until I say it is," Ludwig announced. His voice was shaking, but he yelled above the trembling regardless. He took a few steps back before retreating to the top of the throne room, leaving his soldiers in between himself and the group after his head. "Defend me. Each of you, get out there and kill them." Edelgard didn't seem surprised at that declaration. Instead, she just sighed, her eyes shifting toward disappointment. "You made your decision. Now, you must live with it," she said simply. She rushed forward, pushing back every soldier that dared to raise their weapons at her. The fighters were hesitating even if they were employed by Ludwig rather than the royal family. Fighting against the imperial princess was an easy way to end up executed for treason, and many of them were starting to see it whether they wanted to admit it or not. Shay was more than happy to take out the eager soldiers, and she raised her blades high before slashing them down in a crossed motion. She instinctively threw her molten lava sword into the air before flicking her free hand in the direction of a crowd of soldiers, hitting them with a massive explosion of dark magic. She caught her blade before it could hit the ground, following her momentum forward to knock another set of soldiers backward. From there, Petra and Dorothea finished them off. Monica released a blast of magic that forced back a group of soldiers, and Hubert hit them with a similar explosion of darkness to Shay's own powers. For all of Hubert and Monica's bickering, they fought well together, and their abilities only accentuated Edelgard's skills in charging through the crowd to reach Ludwig. The man was still cowering at the top of the throne room waiting for the group to arrive in his vicinity. He could see there was no way out of this, and so, he decided to hide for as long as he possibly could. Shay saw Ludwig through the haze of the crowd after breaking through another cluster of enemies, and she couldn't help smirking to herself. Ludwig was carrying a large shield and an axe, but she could see by his posture that he didn't know how to use either one of them. In other words, once she could reach him, he was going to fold before the fight could even begin. An easy fight is still a fight, I suppose, Arvel sighed. Come on. Let's go and get this over with already. We still have someone else to go after, and I doubt this is the man we're going to be getting our answers from. Shay nodded. She had forgotten for a moment that she was there in part because she wanted answers about her magic, though she supposed it was easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment when she was concentrated on a fight. All of that would be cast aside soon though, and she would make sure Ludwig paid the price for it. She couldn't wait, and she wasn't even thinking about the answers she was planning on receiving after the battle was over. Edelgard was the first one to arrive in front of Ludwig, and she pointed her axe at him as a threat. She didn't offer him a chance to surrender this time since he had already burned through all of her patience. He was going to put up a fight to the bitter end, and she could see it. She would be more than happy to defeat him then and there though, and so, she lunged forward. Ludwig threw his shield up to try and deflect Edelgard's strike, but his grip on the barrier was faulty, so Edelgard was easily able to push him backward. Her raw strength was impressive and terrifying, and Ludwig stumbled into the wall nearby. Edelgard raised her weapon and prepared to bring it down on his armor, but her prey managed to scurry out of the way at the last second. Unfortunately for Ludwig, that evasive maneuver wasn't enough to grant him the salvation he sought. Instead, he wound up right in the line of fire from Hubert. The blast of shadows knocked Ludwig to the side, and his shield fell to the floor and slid away from him. Ludwig reached for it, but he couldn't reach it in time. Instead, Monica hit the shield with a blast of magic, forcing the barrier off in Dorothea's direction. The other mage kicked it out of the way before sending out a fireball that struck Ludwig head-on. The flames licked at his armor, and he groaned in pain while trying to push himself to his feet. Magical fire didn't burn the same way regular fire did, but the heat was still enough to suffocate him for a handful of seconds. Petra dashed toward Ludwig as soon as the effects of the fire had worn off, and she raised her sword high before bringing it down on a weak point in his armor. Ludwig shrieked in pain but was unable to escape from a follow-up attack that pushed him into the wall. Edelgard was in Petra's place a moment later, and she hit him as hard as she could. Ludwig cried out once again, but this time when he fell to the ground, he couldn't bring himself to get back up. Just as Shay had expected, he hadn't put up much of a fight at all. In fact, it was almost hilarious how easily he had gone down when faced with a bunch of students. Pathetic, Arvel snorted. We didn't even get to hit him. I suppose all's well that ends well though. Now we just need to track down the regent and take him into custody. Meanwhile, Edelgard planted one foot on Ludwig's chest, and she turned to Waldemar where he was standing at the entrance of the room. Take him into the dungeons beneath the castle, she instructed of Waldemar. We can figure out what to do with him after the battle ends. Right now, we still have something else to take care of. Waldemar nodded, and he glanced back into the hallway outside the throne room. Come with me. Shay wondered who he was calling to, but a moment later, she had her answers when a group of loyal Empire soldiers followed Waldemar over to where Ludwig was still crumpled on the ground. A matter of seconds later, Ludwig was hauled up to his feet and dragged away from the throne room. "That takes care of the first one," Monica announced. "All that remains is to find Lord Arundel, yes. Unfortunately, he's bound to be the more frustrating of the two," Hubert said. "I have no doubt that he's here in the palace. It's just a matter of figuring out where he is." "Then we had better get searching," Shay concluded. "As long as he's here, we're not safe. We should be able to consider Duke Agir's soldiers out of the picture now, but I don't want any of them to start fighting again now that they have a commander who presumably knows what he's doing." "Come with me," Edelgard instructed. She started for the throne room's exit, and the Black Eagles followed her easily. The remaining soldiers of Agir left behind scrambled for any sense of purchase, but they found nothing to bring them salvation. Shay shook her head at the sight of them, but she offered them no sympathy. They had made their decision, and they would have to live with it. But until then. "I don't know about you," Arvel began. "But I'm looking forward to this game of cat and mouse." Ferdinand didn't know what he expected to find, but it certainly wasn't this. The Empire was in a state of complete chaos when he arrived at the outskirts of Inber with Linhard, Caspar, and Bernadetta. As was to be expected, Knights of Syros were overflowing from the streets, each of them explaining to the people that something important was happening in the castle. At the very least, the Knights of Syros weren't trying to start a fight. Instead, they were just trying to soothe the commoners. Ferdinand couldn't tell if that made him feel better or worse. "It sounds like everything is happening up at the castle," Caspar remarked. "We should get up there." Ferdinand nodded, and he started to dash toward the palace, but he was cut off when he overheard the opening whispers of a conversation between a few townsfolk nearby. He turned to look at the duo to hear what they were trying to say, and his heart sunk into his feet as he processed the words. "I heard they're fighting against the Prime Minister," one of the two people said. "I wonder what's going on. Why would the princess come to fight the Prime Minister?" "I heard they were fighting the regent," the other person frowned. "Either way, this is bad." Ferdinand froze for about 3 seconds before snapping himself back into reality by shaking his head. "We have to go," he announced. Without missing a beat, he took off running toward the castle, wishing he had been able to bring their horses into the city itself rather than just having to leave them outside. The streets were too crowded to ride a horse even if he wanted to, but he didn't care, not with his desperation to reach his father bubbling over as it was. Linhard, Caspar, and Bernadetta were hot on Ferdinand's heels as he ran toward the castle, though Linhard started wheezing from exertion about 2 minutes into their mad dash. Before he had the chance to ask for a break though, the ground began to shake, and Bernadetta stumbled straight into Caspar. He steadied her as she trembled from horror, her eyes locked squarely on the palace. What was that? Fire orbs. Magic exploded at the ground near Shay's feet, and she couldn't hold back her scream as she was sent flying to the floor. She groaned as she pushed herself to her feet, already knowing she was going to have a horrible bruise on her hip after all of this was over. She hadn't even known there were fire orbs in the castle, much less why they were being unleashed on the Black Eagles. No, that wasn't true. Shay could guess easily enough why all of this was happening. Arundel had figured out what they were doing, and he was willing to do anything to keep them off his back. He refused to give up no matter what, and the Black Eagles were the ones paying the price. Shay had only barely managed to haul herself back to her feet when flares of dark magic filled her vision. When her vision cleared up, she realized the source of the light was teleportation magic. Countless mages had teleported into the room, all of them wearing dark robes and the same bird-like masks Shay had come to know all too well during the mission to rescue Monica. The mercenary let out a stifled whine and an irritated sigh. Arvel just groaned. "You have got to be kidding me." Chapter 13, The Shadows of Adrestia. Was Shay surprised by this turn of events? Not in the slightest. Was she still disappointed? Oh, absolutely. The dark mages that had appeared around her and the rest of the Black Eagles were, in a word, ruthless. Shay primed both of her swords in the direction of those around her, making sure everyone knew just how ready she was to strike. If anyone tried to push her in the wrong way, then she would tear them apart. She wasn't afraid of them even though there was a fairly strong chance she really should have been. She just wanted to get out of this alive. "We should have known," Arvel sighed as Shay started to rush at the dark mages that had them surrounded. If there was information to find here, then there would be people to guard it. I suppose the one who can answer our questions is the regent of the empire. He wants to keep the truth hidden, and that's the reason for him attacking. Shay nodded, and she delivered a swift kick to a soldier that got too close before striking horizontally at another pair of the strange dark mages that tried to come after her. I bet you're right, but that doesn't make this any easier, she muttered, taking care to keep her voice soft so none of the other Black Eagles heard her talking to seemingly no one. I never would have thought the regent would be the one who could help us, but I guess that's what I get for making assumptions. Arvel nodded. All we can do now is wait until the end of the battle and see where it points us, they said simply. In the meantime, the best we can do is fight. Are you ready for that? Shay shrugged as if she had a choice. She really didn't have any options here if she wanted to both survive this battle and hear the answers she had come for. Ludwig von Aegir was clueless about the truth, and it seemed as if he had been used as a distraction and a diversion from the outset. The real mastermind pulling the strings in the Empire's capital was the regent, and Arundel had no intentions of surrendering without a fight. If he was anything like Solon, he probably wouldn't have surrendered at all. Look! Dorothea exclaimed as she pointed off in the distance. Shay pushed back a few other mysterious dark mages before she turned in the direction Dorothea had pointed in. It was hard to make out at first, but Shay realized after a few beats of observation that a massive barrier of dark magic had appeared in the distance. The barrier was trying to keep something or someone hidden, and if the construction of the wall was any indicator, the one who had summoned it was on the same side as Arundel. He was trying to hide himself, and he was willing to do whatever it took if it meant he had a chance of getting away in one piece. Dark mages are summoning a wall to keep us from reaching Lord Arundel, Hubert explained. The casters need to be close. Sweep the area and eliminate them as soon as possible. He could be preparing to warp away at any moment. I would hope that he would know better than to abandon his post so easily, though I guess it's hard to tell with cowards like that, Monica snorted to herself. I never would have thought the regent of the empire would be working with the people who kidnapped me. You would be surprised at how many shadows lurk in the capital, Hubert hummed. Monica offered him a confused glance, but she didn't respond fully, knowing this was hardly the time to ask questions in the first place. Where is Professor Juritsah? Petra questioned of Edelgard. He came with us, did he not? Edelgard nodded. He did. And if I had to guess? She looked up to the wall of darkness, and a few seconds later, the barrier started to falter. It didn't completely fade, but it still staggered before returning to its something that could only imitate its previous level of intensity. You had him out searching for reinforcements before the battle even started, Shay realized, and Edelgard nodded once more. You knew it was going to end up coming to this, so you decided to do as much as you could to make sure we were able to claim the upper hand in the end. Lord Arundel is not a man to be trifled with, and if we wish to find him before he escapes, then we need to act quickly. Lord Aegir was bound to be easy enough to dispose of, so Professor Juritsah's attention needed to be focused elsewhere, Edelgard replied. All we need to do now is find the other few mages. They will only fight more aggressively when they realize one of their allies has fallen. That will put us at an advantage when it comes to finding them and hopefully eliminating them as well. I'm impressed. She's been doing her research if she was able to calculate the actions of her enemies so easily and early into the fight, Arvel hummed. She's going to make for a fine ruler one of these days, and if I had to guess, I would say that she'll be taking over the throne sooner rather than later. That was enough to snap Shay's mind in a direction she hadn't considered up to that point, and she glanced over to Edelgard. When she looked for her house leader though, she saw Edelgard had gotten distracted by the battle once again, and Shay wasn't likely to get an answer. What Shay wanted to know was where the Emperor had gone. As far as she was concerned, he was still alive, but due to his sickness, the regent had taken over ruling the empire. If that was the case, then where was he in the midst of all this chaos? That's a question that we'll have to wait until after all of this has been solved, Arvel told her. For now, we should focus on the fight at hand. I don't know about you, but I kind of like having my head attached to my shoulders. I do too, and you don't have a choice in that, Shay reminded them. If she was alive, then they had to be too, and the reverse was true as well. Shay shook her head and rushed forward once again, kicking backward off one of the mages just in time to avoid a blast of icy magic from Monica's direction. Shay landed in a crouch and jumped out of the way of an upcoming strike. Petra rushed forward and slashed down a dark mage that stood in front of her. As soon as the man crumpled, the dark shield began to falter once again. Dorothea hit the mage once again, sending another ripple through the barrier before permanently weakening it. There was only one mage left as far as Shay could tell, and they couldn't sustain something that massive for long without falling apart. In other words, it wouldn't take too much pushing for her to defeat the next mage. It didn't take long to pick out the last of the mages given the aggressive nature of their fighting style, and Shay gladly rushed toward them. She and Juritzau struck down their target at the same time, and the barrier of dark magic in the distance faded away before anyone on the enemy side could even think of putting the shield back up. Shay smirked with pride and started to run toward the newly opened halls of the castle. The sooner she could reach her target, the better. Arundel wouldn't know what hit him until it was too late. Dorothea, Petra, Monica, clear up the rest of the important points nearby, Edelgard declared, and the other Black Eagles nodded before scattering throughout the castle. We need to defeat every mage before we can consider victory ours. If we weaken the rest of the army, then Lord Arundel will fall easily. You've got it, Your Majesty, Monica smiled. She was the last of the three to disappear into the crowd, her magic marking her presence with explosions of light and ice. Any mage that dared to get too close to her was struck down in the blink of an eye, clearing a path forward for her easily. Edelgard and Hubert continued to charge forward once they were sure the rest of their allies were ready to take out the remainder of the enemy trash. Neither one of them entertained the idea of asking if the other was all right, knowing the answer would be far from simple enough to articulate in the heat of a battle even if they received it. At the moment, all that mattered was stopping Arundel. The rest of the details would fall into place when the battle was finished and the dust had settled. They just needed to focus. By the time Edelgard and Hubert had arrived, Shay and Juritzau had already surged toward their enemies, and they were clearing out the remainder of the dark mages that surrounded Arundel. None of them had ever seen Arundel looking so cornered and anxious, though he refused to let the depth of his fears shine through. His expression was tense, and he released a few blasts of dark magic to try and cover his escape. Before he could get away though, Hubert created an explosion of purple magic just behind Arundel, locking him in the room with the rest of the group. Arundel's eyes hardened into a glare, and his gaze caught Edelgard and Hubert a moment later. He stared at them as Edelgard started to stalk toward him, and his expression twisted to the unreadable. Edelgard, on the other hand, didn't care at all about his concerns. Instead, she just pointed her axe in his direction. "It's over," she announced. "I would offer you the chance to surrender, but I know it won't end the way I would prefer. You were always too stubborn for your own good." "I could say the same about you," Arundel glared. "You shouldn't have done any of this. What is it you mean to accomplish?" "I'm going to take the Empire back. I've had enough of being controlled," Edelgard replied. "It all ends here and now." Arundel shook his head. "You will only learn too late how great of an error you are making," he told her. "Allow me to be the one to show you your mistakes." Edelgard took in a grounding breath as Arundel released a spell in her direction. She rolled out of the way and came up in a crouch, her axe at the ready to strike at his chest. Arundel staggered back from the hit, but he didn't suffer as much damage as Edelgard would have liked. When he tried to move away from Edelgard to prepare an attack, he was cut off by a cut from a sword that struck at him from behind. Arundel turned and was met with none other than Shay, who was smirking up at him without a care in the world. With Juritzau and Hubert covering her and Edelgard, Shay was free to do whatever she wanted to strike at Arundel, and she knew she was going to enjoy every second of this. If it would give her the answers she needed, then she would do it. If it would free the Empire from his grip, then she would do it. "Are you ready?" Arvel questioned. Shay simply nodded. With that, light kicked up around Shay's feet, and her hair dyed itself red, orange, and pink. A few markings scattered themselves across Shay's skin, and the molten lava pattern on her sword glowed even brighter. Adrenaline coursed through Shay's body even more readily than before, and she used it to launch herself toward Arundel, both swords raised high above her head. Arundel turned to face her, his eyes wide. "You're... No," he murmured. His face had gone frighteningly pale, though he didn't bother with explaining why. Instead, he just threw his arms up in an attempt to brace for impact from Shay's sharpened blades. Shay pushed him backward easily, and Arundel slid across the floor of the room. Shay glared up at her target, mind racing all the while. That sounded like something he would have only said if he recognized her to some degree. Edelgard had been right when she said Shay could look forward to finding answers therein in Bear. Unfortunately, Arundel didn't seem ready to open up about what he knew, so Shay pushed the subject as hard as she could. "What was that?" she questioned. Arundel offered no easy response, and so, Shay pressed forward again. "You know something about me, don't you?" Arundel didn't answer, instead just casting yet another dark spell that made the ground at Shay's feet start to shake. The mercenary swore under her breath and jumped out of the way. Arundel wasn't going to be giving her the information she was looking for unless she dragged it out of him by force, and that would probably only be possible when he was captured. Shay thanked the goddess for her luck. She was confident Arundel was the one the church had wanted to see taken in so they could interrogate them himself. She would have all the time in the world to ask questions later, but until then, she needed to strike him down. Edelgard charged toward Arundel from the other direction, her axe raised high before she slammed it down on her target. Arundel charged up a fireball, but he never had the chance to fire it. Instead, Shay released an explosion of shadows that forced Arundel backwards while giving Edelgard the chance to escape. The heir of Adrestia took advantage of this opportunity to swerve around behind him, striking at his back with her axe. Arundel stumbled forward, and blood started to streak through the tears in his clothing. Sweat beaded along his forehead, but he would not back down. Edelgard smiled at him, that charming grin suddenly seeming twisted under the influence of circumstances. "Do you understand the situation you're in?" Edelgard questioned. Arundel admitted to nothing though, instead charging up yet another magical attack to strike at her. Before the attack could hit though, Juritsa intervened, his lance piercing Arendel's defenses from the side. He was quick to retreat a moment later though, recognizing this was Edelgard's fight and not his. It was enough of a distraction for Edelgard to gather her bearings once again though, and she surged toward her uncle like a tidal wave. Regardless of Arendel's strength, he couldn't sustain so much damage without starting to falter, and it was starting to show. As long as he was showing weakness though, Shay was happy to take advantage of it, and she lunged toward Arundel from the opposite side, pinching her target in between herself and Edelgard. He couldn't escape, and he could see it. So instead, he opted to try something else. He charged up another fire spell and pointed it at Edelgard, but she was moving too quickly to change course or dodge. Her eyes went wide in preparation for the strike. But she never felt it. Instead, Shay's body blurred into a haze of purple, and she pushed Edelgard to the side just in time to get her out of the line of fire. The fireball struck Shay straight in the chest instead, and the world began to tilt. All the air in her lungs was forced out in the blink of an eye, and for a moment, that pain was all she cared about. It didn't take long for her to hit the ground though, and she rolled once and then twice before finally coming to a stop. After using her speed to avoid most major hits throughout the battle, that stung far more than she had expected it to, and she had no idea how she was supposed to pry herself off the ground again. But she had to try, so she pushed her body up as carefully as she could manage without somehow sending herself crashing back down again. Edelgard was facing off against Arundel still, and she rushed forward to strike at him with her axe held high. She was hesitant though, and her fear was starting to catch up with her regardless of how certain she tried to appear. As it turned out, she had every right to be afraid. Darkness appeared from around Arendel's feet, and it swallowed his entire body in a matter of seconds. Soon afterward, he had been replaced by the imposing figure of a different man. Judging by his pale skin and seemingly empty eyes, he was of the same ilk as Solon from back at the monastery. Shay blinked a few times as she tried to get a grip on what she was seeing, and something in the back of her mind told her that the man's name was Thales. She had no evidence, but her instincts had been correct before as well, right? Edelgard held up her axe to deflect another attack, and she was sent sliding backward across the ground before landing in a crouch when she couldn't maintain her balance anymore. The man, Thales, looked at both Edelgard and Shay and raised one hand as both a threat and a promise of violence. "You have made a grave error here today," he announced. "And you will see the damage you have done soon enough." I will see to it personally. Before Edelgard had the chance to strike at him once again, Thales clicked his fingers together, and the darkness from before consumed him once more. When the purple glow faded, nothing but the memory of Thales was left behind. Edelgard glanced around to ensure he wasn't there still, and she quickly realized he was not. Thales was long gone, and their mission had been a success. They had managed to drive the intruders out of the castle. But was it really a victory? That's unfortunate, Edelgard hummed. She turned back to Shay and reached one hand out to help the mercenary steady herself. Shay rose to her full height and allowed a small puff of magic to surround her, releasing the color from her hair and returning it to its regular purple. We were supposed to capture him for information, though it seems he had other plans. He's the one who could have answered my questions, isn't he? Shay questioned, though she already knew what the answer was going to be. Her stomach started to sink at the realization that she had come this far only for everything to crumble at the last second. She had come so close, and she had even seen it on Thales' face that he knew something about her, but since he had fled, there was no way of hearing the depth of what he understood. Yes, Edelgard nodded. I can only assume the church will begin to search for him now that he has escaped. We will need to do the same as well. It was a cowardly move, but it's hardly surprising given the one performing it. Shay nodded vaguely at that, and Edelgard took a step toward Hubert and Juritsah. The two had finished much of their work in the fight already, having cleaned up most of the reinforcements around Thales. When Thales warped away, he had taken most of his forces with him, it seemed, not that Shay had noticed until after they had already vanished. Edelgard was much faster to catch up with the situation though, and she addressed everyone else in the room a moment later. Spread out and search the area. We need to make sure there aren't any others in the area, she declared. Nobody dared to object as they fanned out throughout the castle. Shay started walking away, though she spared one glance at Edelgard over her shoulder. Part of her wanted to ask if Edelgard knew what had happened to her father, but at the same time, Shay was sure this wasn't the time as long as Edelgard was concentrated on other things. Instead, Shay let out a heavy sigh and focused on putting one foot in front of the other as part of her search of the palace. That certainly ended about as well as I expected it to, Arvel remarked once they were sure they were alone. I had been fearing he would teleport away the instant he realized we were in the area, and it seems I was right. Our enemies love to make use of that special type of warping magic, and it always ends up being a pain for us. You can say that again, Shay sighed. She glanced around the area once again just to make sure nobody was listening in. I was really hoping he would be able to answer a few of my questions, but I guess someone like that wouldn't want to do anything to help me in the first place. He's an enemy, after all, and what reason would he have to tell me anything he knows about my past or future? It may be for the best, Arvel pointed out. I wouldn't want him to say anything that could fill your head with doubts. This is the life we've chosen, and we should do our best to make the most of it. We're here for a reason, and I believe we should go with it for as long as we can. Shay nodded. You're probably right. But you saw it, didn't you? He recognized me. Or maybe he just recognized the magic I was using. I'm not sure. But he knows something about me, and we weren't able to hear it. Now, he's gone, and I don't know if we're ever going to see him again. I wouldn't be so sure about that, Arvel countered. Someone like that seems like they get into tons of trouble. It wouldn't shock me if we ran into them again one day. Though we would need to be careful if that did happen. I doubt they would be willing to speak with us freely about the past or the present. You can say that again, Shay sighed. She looked around one more time just to make sure she was alone, and when she realized there were no reinforcements, she drifted over to a nearby window to look out over the rest of Inver. There were knights gathered all down the streets, speaking with the citizens and trying to keep them calm. The church had held up its end of the bargain, Shay could see, and she could only hope that would help them in the future. But when Shay looked down a bit more, she realized all was not as peaceful as she would have hoped. Instead, she was met with what seemed to be some sort of scuffle just outside the castle gates. She couldn't see who was involved or what was going on, but she knew it had to be significant somehow. Do you have any idea who that could be? Shay questioned of Arvel even though she highly doubted they would be able to help her at all. Not a clue, Arvel admitted. though I suppose we should investigate it as soon as possible. Something tells me we're going to want to know about all of this. Shay nodded. You're probably right. Come on. Let's get to it. All things considered, finding him was the easy part. Hubert had known exactly where his father was going to be waiting for him when all of this began, and he was pleased to see that the information he had gathered had proven to be correct. Edelgard hadn't requested the aid of Hubert's father when the battle in the capital began, since she knew Hubert thought it to be a poor idea. She may have been alright with stepping outside of her comfort zone every once in a while, but this was a different matter entirely. Hubert had told her this was one man not to be trusted, and she understood that all too well. Hubert had been planning this from the start. He had said ages ago when he first began to plan this endeavor with Edelgard that he would need to dispose of one of their enemies in the Empire before the war began. She had trusted him to do the right thing, and he refused to allow her faith to be misplaced. With the battle in the castle finished, he had all the time in the world to fight his father and ensure he was named as the next leader of House Vestra. He had more than earned that right. He had planned all of this as much as he possibly could. His siblings would not be there for the sake of their own safety. He refused to put those he cared for in danger when there was so much on the line. Hubert's only issue here was with his father and his inaction in the past, and he would make sure his target understood that. Before the day was over, he would be the one in charge, and he would ensure that the horrors of the past never repeated themselves again. As was to be expected, the chaos at the castle had drawn everyone out of hiding and into the open. The only nobles asked to help with the assault were those of houses Berglis and Hevering, but all the others had come out to gawk out of morbid curiosity and fear. Marquis Vestra was among them, and as soon as Hubert saw him, he allowed a small smirk to spread across his lips. Found you. Hubert allowed dark magic to crackle across his fingertips. This was everything he had ever been waiting for, and he would not let this chance go to waste. It all ended today. Shay still refused to allow her transformation to drop fully as she moved toward the gates of the Inver Palace. Her hair was back to its regular color, but her sword remained poised firmly in her grasp as she investigated the disturbance. Shay somehow doubted their enemies would do something as graceless as trying to start a fight near the gates of the castle, but she refused to let herself take any chances. She needed to make sure everything was okay first. Only then would everything be alright. When Shay stopped in front of the castle gates though, she was met with an argument that consisted of a variety of familiar voices. It took her a moment to figure out who was saying what because of how overwhelming it all was. Too many people were talking at once, and Shay blinked a few times to ground herself before she fully registered who was leading the charge. I need to get inside the castle, Ferdinand exclaimed. Behind him, Linhard, Caspar, and Bernadetta stood. Bernadetta was practically hiding behind Caspar, her hands braced against his shoulders just to make sure he didn't move from his position as her shield. Caspar didn't push her away, either not minding it or choosing to not make it an issue. Ferdinand? Shay questioned as she approached the quartet. She had been sure they had all stayed back at the monastery. What in the world were they doing here in the capital? Did they know what was going on? Had Edelgard asked them to come as reinforcements later on? No, that couldn't have been it. If Edelgard had wanted them there, then she would have told the guards at the gates to let them in if they made themselves known. Shay? Ferdinand asked in return. That was enough to earn the mercenary the attention of the rest of her classmates as well, and they all glanced over to her in thinly veiled confusion. I'm glad you're here. They won't let us in, and we need to know what's going on. Shay looked around the immediate area to ensure there were no other dark mages waiting to strike her when she let her guard down, and when she found nothing, she allowed her molten blade to disappear as ash on the wind. Come on, she told the group. The others are in the castle. I think we should talk about all of this. Ferdinand nodded, and he gladly pushed his way through the nearby soldiers. The guards didn't bother with trying to stop him once he had set his sights on getting inside, no doubt because Shay had said it was all right. Ferdinand's determination allowed the others to follow in his path as well, and they all slipped into the castle from there. I believe I know why Edelgard didn't want Ferdinand to come along, Arvel remarked. He may have gotten in the way of her efforts to arrest his father. Now that he's here though, there's little we can do to reverse his presence. Besides, he will need to hear the truth sooner or later. We may as well get it over with. Shay hummed but offered no verbal response, knowing it would have let the others in on the fact that she knew more than she was willing to show openly. She was already nervous enough about how they were going to respond, and Shay could only hope this didn't come back to bite them all somehow. She trusted the Black Eagles, of course, but this was an unfortunate situation at best, and she didn't want to cause any issues. If this is going to cause any problems, I can assure you they go well beyond you not getting along with your classmates as well anymore, Arvel pointed out. Thales is still out there, and we don't know anything more than we did before. So much for finding answers. At least we won, Shay thought to herself. I just wish the victory didn't feel so hollow. Chapter 14, Crowning an Emperor. Shay led the rest of the Black Eagles through the halls of the palace carefully. Everyone was so distracted by examining their surroundings to ask any questions vocally, no doubt planning on questioning Edelgard herself as soon as she arrived in the area. The treacherous Empire soldiers that had sided with Ludwig and Arundel were scattered throughout the castle in varying states of health, though most of them were struggling thanks to marks of either slashes or explosions across their armor. Ferdinand remained the quietest out of the group, swallowing back his nerves as much as he could while focusing on the path ahead. Shay could only assume that he recognized the armor used by his father's personal guard, and the implication that Ludwig had been involved with the fight was scaring him much more than he wanted to admit. Shay could hardly blame him for being anxious. It must have been awful for half of your friends to step away for a while only to reunite with them and find that a massive battle had broken out. Shay easily found the throne room and waited there for everyone else to arrive. Dorothea and Petra were already there, with Dorothea wrapping a few bandages around Petra's leg from where she had received a small cut during the ending stages of the fight. Monica stood nearby, though to be more accurate, she was pacing the length of the room nearby. Even Juritsah was there, though he was somehow even more terrifying than usual given the way he glared at his lance as he cleaned the final traces of blood from its tip. Edelgard and Hubert were nowhere to be seen, and Shay quickly identified that as the source of Monica's unrest. Shay could only hope the two of them knew what they were doing, but she knew she was just going to have to wait before she could hear her answers no matter how much she wanted to just find them already. Hubert returned soon afterward, and much like Juritsah, he somehow seemed even more sinister than ever before. His smile was impossible to trace, and Shay chose to avert her eyes since she didn't think she would be able to stand having to theorize about what he had been up to. On the best of days, Hubert could be terrifying because of all the trouble he could get into when no one else was around. This was far from being a good day as far as she was concerned, and Hubert's quiet demeanor only made her feel worse, not that she wanted to admit that aloud. Instead, she just bit down on the skin on her bottom lip and waited for Edelgard to return. When Edelgard arrived in the room, she immediately turned her attention to Hubert and Monica, the latter of whom stopped pacing as soon as she realized Edelgard had arrived. All the preparations are underway, she told them. We should be ready to begin soon. Preparations for what, Edie? Dorothea questioned as she perked up from where she was sitting next to Petra. She finished her work on Petra's wound and rose to her full height. Petra, meanwhile, tested putting weight on her leg and nodded in Dorothea's direction when she was certain she was cleared to stand once again. My coronation, Edelgard replied. Everyone in the room stared at her as if she had grown a second head, but she didn't seem bothered at all. Instead, she just turned to look at Ferdinand, Linhard, Caspar, and Bernadetta where the quartet was gathered just behind Shay. I wasn't expecting all of you this soon. What are you doing here? Ferdinand stared at her in horrified shock before any sense of restraint he had finally snapped. We demand an explanation. He cried out. You arrested my father, Edelgard. How could you do such a thing without discussing it with me first? What exactly is going on here in the first place? Why did you leave us back at the monastery while you were preparing for a massive battle like this? Caspar questioned. We could have helped you out, you know. There was no reason to just ditch us. I intend to explain all of this in due time, Edelgard assured him. There were many factors at play here, and I would like to fill you in on it from start to finish. First though, we have other matters to attend to. Other matters such as my coronation. Your coronation. Are you going to become the emperor? Linhard asked, his eyes widening ever so slightly. Edelgard hesitated before nodding. In the midst of the battle, my father was killed. With no one else to lead the empire, the duty falls to me, she explained. It seems the regent turned to cowardice and treason the instant he felt his back hit the wall behind him. I went to find my father once the battle was over, and when I did, I found that he had been killed in the chaos. That means I must take to the throne as soon as possible to fill the vacuum he left behind. Shay stared down at the ground, suddenly feeling like she was going to be sick. She wished she had said something to ask over Edelgard's father soon. Even though they had won and reclaimed the empire from the people who would do it harm, Edelgard had still lost her only blood family left. Shay's mind went back to how she had felt when she lost Getz, Lazai, and Berlin all those months ago, and one of her arms instinctively curled around her abdomen in an attempt to ground herself. I'm so sorry, Edelgard, Shay forced herself to say even though the words were desperate to get caught in her throat and never see the light of day. Edelgard hesitated at those words, but she shook them off a moment later, not quite letting anyone see just how upset she was. We did what we had to, she eventually told Shay. That's what matters most. Now, we stand here together, and we can do something to fix this. Why exactly did you do all of this in the first place? Ferdinand questioned. His rage had cooled slightly, but it had not faded. His cheeks were red from fury and grief over his father's arrest, and Shay felt a pull of sympathy in her chest. She wished she could do something more to help him, though she doubted much of anything would be able to pull Ferdinand out of his rut at the moment, not with how everything had ended. There were spies in the Empire's capital who were attempting to overthrow it and conquer Fodlan, Hubert explained bluntly. They are part of a greater organization known as, those who slither in the dark. We came here to eliminate those who worked with them as well as their leader. Unfortunately, the man responsible for all of this managed to escape when the battle reached its end. Ferdinand's eyes went wide with shock. You mean? My father knew about all of this? He asked, his voice soft and fading fast. My father was involved with people who were trying to tear the empire apart. I will explain everything when the time is right, Edelgard assured him. For now, you are all safe here in the palace. We will talk after the coronation ceremony has ended. Please, make yourselves at home in the meantime. My hospitality is yours as well. Ferdinand tried to sputter out another objection to press the truth out of Edelgard, but he never had the chance. The princess had pivoted on her heel and walked out of the room before he could even think of pulling the words together, leaving the heir to House Aegir to sigh to himself as one hand came up to rest on his forehead. The rest of the throne room fell silent, and Shay continued to work the skin on her bottom lip between her teeth. All of a sudden, her previous uncertainty about Edelgard's secrecy had come rushing in full force. Even if Edelgard had promised to share the truth with everyone whenever she had been crowned as emperor, Shay didn't want to have to wait that long. In fact, the idea of waiting all that time to discuss what had just happened made her feel awful. I'm going to go get some air, Shay eventually said. She was gone before anyone had the chance to object, though she assumed at least someone else was planning on heading out of the throne room soon too. The air in there was suffocating because of the weight of secrets hanging all around them, and Shay couldn't take it anymore. They needed to wait until the end of the coronation ceremony to ask Edelgard any questions, and being left alone with their thoughts was a special type of torture none of them wanted to endure. So Shay made her way through the winding halls of the castle to a balcony she had spotted in passing during the fight. She pushed her way out onto the outcropping that overlooked the world below, swallowing back her nerves and trying to stay focused on the situation at hand. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them once again, she was somewhere else. Mentally, she was in the realm of space and shadows Arvel stayed in within the back of her own mind. She may have physically been in the Empire's castle, but mentally, Shay had never been farther away. Those who slither in the dark. Arvel hummed to themselves. They closed their eyes in thought before shaking their head. It sounds so familiar, but I can't seem to figure out where I would have heard it before. The way Hubert was talking about them made it seem as if they were hiding on purpose, and given the context, that wouldn't shock me. So how in the world would I have come to know about them? I have no idea, Shay admitted with a shake of her own head. It all just bothers me. We can't seem to catch a break. I had been hoping this would finally be the time where we found out what we've been looking for, but instead, it feels like we're just as clueless as ever before. We can't exactly figure out where our magic comes from if everyone who might be able to help us keeps teleporting away before we can get the answers out of them. At this point, it's almost comical how little we understand. But we do know one thing, Arvel corrected. That man. Arundel, I think it was. You saw the way he looked at you. He recognized you and the magic you were using. He may not have said openly where he had seen it before, but I know for a fact that he recognized you before he ran away. That has to count for something. But we don't know what it means. He could have recognized me for many reasons, but we have no way of saying what any of those reasons are or if they could help us in the long run, Shay sighed. She let one hand come up to rest on her temple to nurse away the warning pounds of a migraine, though she couldn't tell if the headache existed only within her own mind's world or if it was physical as well. And now, I have even more questions than ever before. I wonder if Edelgard or Hubert would be able to help me. I mean, they seem to know quite a bit about these Slitherers, so they could point us in the right direction. Arvel let out a small scoff. Slitherers. They repeated, arching an eyebrow in Shay's direction. Shay just rolled her eyes. Those who slither in the dark is a mouthful, and it's pretentious as all hell. As far as I'm concerned, they're snakes, and annoying ones at that. They're Slitherers, and that's all there is to it, she told Arvel. If you have a better nickname for them than that, then I'd be glad to hear it. Arvel shook their head. I probably don't have anything better than that, but calling criminals that supposedly want to bring the entire world to its knees Slitherers is overwhelmingly pathetic. They're overwhelmingly pathetic, so if you ask me, they asked for it first, Shay countered, and Arvel just snickered. Shay sighed heavily. That's not the point though. I want to ask Edelgard what she knows when all of this is over. After her coronation ceremony, she's going to explain everything to all of us, and when she does, I'm going to push her for answers. I hope it ends the way you're hoping it will, Arvel remarked, reverting to their regular serious demeanor a moment later. I don't know if Edelgard will be willing to share secrets like that so freely, though I suppose it never hurts to ask. Edelgard certainly seems like the type to keep her hand close to her chest. She didn't even say anything to half the Black Eagles before she took off. I don't know why she was so desperate to keep it hidden from all of them when they were going to end up finding out the truth eventually anyway. And if I had to guess, I would say she already knew they were going to figure it out before the battle in the capital was over, Shay pointed out. You heard how she talked about them when they got here. She didn't seem surprised that they were here as much as she was surprised they were here so soon. She always knew they were going to try and follow us, and she must have been planning around that. But why plan around that when she could have just invited them to begin with? She was likely trying to keep Ferdinand from getting suspicious over not being invited to our little coup, Arvel said. If he was the only one not invited, then he would have asked a lot of questions much sooner. If the others stayed behind, then that would hide the truth a little bit more. It was hardly a flawless plan, but it was something, and it seems to have worked out the way she was hoping. Shay sighed, pinching at the bridge of her nose. I'll just ask her about it later. Even if she doesn't answer my questions, I can at least say I tried, she declared. Until then, I need a nap. I don't think I've ever needed sleep this desperately before. That hit from Thales really took it out of you, huh? Arvel questioned, and Shay nodded. She could still feel the sting from where she had hit the ground when fighting against Thales near the end of the encounter, and she wanted to sleep it off as much as possible, especially if she was looking forward to a coronation ceremony at some point in the next few days. She wanted to be at her best when she saw her house leader crowned as the ruler of a new country, after all. Let's go find a spare room to crash in, Shay told Arvel. When they nodded, she closed her eyes, opening them once again back in reality. Shay shook her head and started to walk back toward the castle after looking over the city for a few moments longer. The knights were still gathered in the streets of Inver, though if Shay had to guess, she would say they would be returning to the monastery again soon with a message about their simultaneous success and defeat. Someone had to tell Rhea that Thales had escaped, after all. As far as Shay was concerned though, that was a problem for someone else to address. She needed a break after all of that, and damn it, she was going to take one. The following afternoon, the coronation ceremony for Edelgard took place. It was sudden and lacking in any degree of formality because of how quickly it had come up, but nobody dared to complain about it where they could be heard. Instead, the Black Eagles just focused on milling about the castle with snacks on small plates and drinks in their hands to celebrate the occasion. It was hardly the massive party any of them had expected, but it was at least something, and as long as it was enough for Edelgard, it was enough for the rest of them. Edelgard herself was handling this with a surprising degree of grace, and Shay couldn't help but be impressed with the newly crowned emperor. If Shay had been put in a position like that, she knew she would have completely snapped under the pressure in a matter of hours. Then again, she supposed that was probably why Edelgard was the who had been raised to take charge of a nation. Shay was just a simple mercenary, and she knew it. If Shay had to guess, she would have assumed that Edelgard wasn't surprised by the way things had turned out at all. She must have known for years that her uncle was going to try and betray her the instant he had the chance, though if Shay was being honest, he had probably betrayed her years ago and was only just now able to show it openly. Beyond that, Shay had to wonder if Arundel Thales actually was even her uncle at all. It wouldn't have surprised Shay at all if perhaps Thales had taken Arendel's place at some point, pushing the original bearer of that name into the darkness so that he could find control instead. Thales unfortunately asked far more questions than he answered, and Shay couldn't stop thinking through each of them as the minutes ticked by. The Knights of Syros had been sent back to the monastery that morning with the information the group had managed to acquire throughout the battle. They were set to tell Rhea that Arundel had managed to escape after transforming into a man with pale skin and even paler hair. Shay had a feeling they could expect other knights to arrive in the capital soon to try and conduct a deeper investigation into the matter at hand, but she didn't want to ask about it when everyone else had so much on their plates. She also didn't want to push it when they had so many questions on their minds. Edelgard wasn't going to leave the Black Eagles in the dark for too long though. After the festivities had died out and the guests from the coronation ceremony were sent back home, Edelgard settled down with the rest of her allies in the throne room. She didn't opt to sit on the throne though, instead simply standing with the Black Eagles on equal footing. Her charming smile never faded for even a minute, and Shay couldn't help but find the grin reassuring in a world filled to the brim with uncertainties. They could all use a bit of a confidence booster, and Edelgard had to know it. "All right, everyone," Edelgard declared. "You said that you wanted to hear more about the enemies we're up against, yes?" "I wanted to know why you had my father arrested, Edelgard," Ferdinand corrected. He had been on edge ever since arriving in Inver, and his grip on his glass was so tight that he seemed ready to completely shatter it and leave the shards behind in his palm. "You still haven't explained that." "I suppose I haven't," Edelgard hummed. "Ludwig von Aegir has been arrested for high treason against the Empire. He was working with mages who have been working to destroy the Empire from the inside out for quite some time now, and as such, he cannot be trusted to hold a position of power anymore. My uncle, Volkhard von Arundel, was one of the mages he was working with. They are also affiliated with Tomasz and Kronia from our previous mission at the monastery. As such, they are incredibly dangerous. All of them work as part of an organization that calls themselves those who slither in the dark. They wish to pull Fodlan apart inside out, and their methods of doing so involve infiltration and planting the seeds of distrust anywhere they can find purchase," Hubert went on. "Leaving them be was simply not an option. We saw the chance to strike, and we took it as soon as possible." "How long have they been here then?" Caspar asked, his face pale with anxiety. "Those mages, I mean. It sounds like you've known about them for a long time." "They've been here for quite a few years now, but nobody would have ever believed us had we tried to push back against them," Edelgard answered. "The mages have the ability to change their appearances to look like whoever they want." Declaring that shape-shifting mages had infiltrated the palace and were trying to tear the Empire apart from the inside out surely wouldn't have inspired much confidence in our allies. "So you had to wait until others believed you that they existed, and now that the Church knows about it, you can actually work to get rid of them," Shay concluded, and Edelgard nodded. "I see. That makes a lot of sense, though I'm willing to bet it was agonizing waiting so long for a crack in their armor to show." "Regardless of how long it took, they are out of the picture now," Hubert cut in, casting Shay a glare that would have made anyone wither on the spot. Shay just chose to look away to ensure her own safety and sanity. "That means we can continue with our own plans to take the Empire back from them." It will hardly be easy given the scars they left behind, but we have no other choice in the matter. I bet the church will be able to help out quite a bit, Dorothea pointed out. They have a personal stake in all of this too. We saw a traitor infiltrate their ranks before fleeing too. That means there are others who are trying to track them down. I doubt finding them will be as easy as we would have liked, unfortunately, Edelgard frowned. They know how to hide. Their shape-shifting skills are a perfect indication of that. We need to find a way to push through them without them getting the jump on us first. It won't be easy, but we need to try. Now that you're in charge of the Empire, I think we can begin our efforts to find them in earnest, Monica declared. This is an important first step, and it's bound to lead us to great places if we know where we're going. Divorcing the Empire from spies like that won't be easy though, Linhard interjected. If they've been around for as long as you make it sound, then you've got a long road ahead of yourselves if you want to fix this. It's easy to ruin something, but fixing it takes a lot more effort. Perhaps, but this is one thing worth the while. I'm sure of it, Edelgard told him. Besides, I already have a plan in motion. Counts Berglis and Hevering will be working with me personally to address a plan for the Empire's future. We will also be reconstructing the Southern Church over the course of the next few years. It's been quite some time since the Empire had a religious institution to lean on outside of Gareg Mach, and I believe the people could use the boost to morale given how profoundly their faith was shaken here today. I will also be taking over as the Minister of the Imperial Household, Hubert declared. My father, Marquis Vestra, unfortunately perished during the struggle to capture Duke Agir. As such, I will be stepping up to inherit the position he left behind. His eyes gleamed sinisterly, and Shay couldn't tell if this was normal Hubert behavior or if she should have been asking more questions. She ultimately opted to remain silent, knowing she probably wouldn't have made it far even if she wanted to dig deeper. Hubert was a man who knew how to keep his secrets, after all, and he would make sure the truth stayed under the rug as long as he thought that was where it belonged. You really do have this all figured out, huh? Bernadetta remarked, her eyes wide as could be. I guess I shouldn't have underestimated you. What are we supposed to do though? If you're the Emperor, then we can't really go back to the Officers' Academy. You were supposed to be our house leader. That will be a matter to be considered at another time, Edelgard replied. I'm still uncertain as to what will come of this next. I didn't anticipate having the chance to overthrow my uncle so soon, but now that we're here, this is what must be done. I still can't believe my father was working with someone like that. Ferdinand murmured. And he knew about all of this? He was planning on fighting against you and your allies as well, Edelgard. He was, Edelgard nodded. I'm sorry you had to hear the truth this way, but your father was not the man you thought he was. We will be deciding what to do with him at a later point, but for now, he will remain locked in the dungeons until we can question him about what else he knows. Ferdinand nodded vacantly at that, though Shay knew he had to have more on his mind he just didn't have the confidence to say yet. Shay looked away from him passively, wishing there was something else she could have said or done to help but knowing it wasn't going to be that simple. Nothing was ever that easy, especially when the Empire had witnessed a coup the day before. Goddess above, Shay had been involved with a coup. While we iron out the remainder of the details though, you are all welcome to stay here in the palace, Edelgard continued. If you need something, all you need to do is ask. We are more than happy to host you for as long as will be necessary. I will likely be busy most of the time with meetings regarding the future of the Empire, but there will be people here to help you if you find yourself in need of assistance. Do your best to stay out of trouble, Hubert declared to the Black Eagles. He gave a somewhat pointed look at Caspar with that instruction, and Caspar sighed in exasperation but said nothing. With that, Edelgard and Hubert started for the door, no doubt off to attend to whatever meeting was set to occupy their attention next. Wow! I never would have thought yesterday's battle would end quite like this, Dorothea admitted once the pair had vanished from view. I never imagined I would be involved with a coup. Though I suppose that was probably part of the point from the start. The Southern Church being re-established is certainly interesting, Linhard hummed. The Southern Church was torn down about 100 years ago because it sparked an insurrection of its own. Afterwards, it was replaced by the Ministry of Religious Affairs under House Varley. Since then, the empire has relied primarily on the central church for all matters of faith. Bernadetta's face fell at the mention of her house. I suppose that means my father is going to end up involved with all of that. She stared down at the ground for a long moment, her gaze watery, before she shook her head. He can do what he wants as long as he does it away from me. I know Edelgard probably has a reason for all of this. Shay was almost tempted to ask Bernadetta what she meant by that, but before she had the chance, the conversation continued to move around her. I am left wondering where this will put Brigid, Petra commented. I will need to ask Edelgard for her thoughts when she finds the time. This is going to be a new era for the Empire unlike anything any of us have ever seen, Monica smiled. I'm looking forward to seeing what Her Majesty does with all of this. And I'm curious about how this is going to impact our time at the monastery, Arvel remarked. I never would have thought we would be pulled away so soon, but it seems as if there will be little point to us returning to the Officers' Academy at this point. There's a lot of valuable work to be found here in the Empire, and going back to school would only hold us back, especially if we're going to be left without a house leader. Shay nodded at that, pretending she was agreeing with what Monica was saying. She had no idea what any of this was going to mean when it came to the Officers' Academy, though she supposed the truth would make itself known with time. Until then, she just needed to hang on amidst the tempest of changes that had consumed her life so quickly. That was much easier said than done, of course, but she had to try. Shay couldn't help wondering how things were going back at the monastery. The other houses were no doubt in their classes as she thought about it, focusing all their attention on becoming better fighters and leaders. Shay doubted their days were as interesting as hers had become, though she supposed that didn't matter much. The other two nations were at peace, and that was a good thing for Faerghus and Leicester. Hopefully, none of the other countries would need to worry about conflict like this for quite some time. Little did Shay know though, any ideals of peace for Fodlan had long since fallen apart. A few days could change a lot, and the last few days had shattered all tranquility the other nations had known. Adrestia had been the first to struggle, but it would not be the last, and figures cloaked in shadow would make sure of it. Chapter 15, A Coming Coup. Excuse me. The Blue Lion's classroom was largely silent and had been for the last minute or so. Felix was the first one to speak, his expression twisted with so much disgust that he barely seemed to be able to contain his rage. Everyone else looked horrified, with Annette and Ingrid having covered their mouths with their hands as they gaped at Dimitri. The only person somewhat neutral throughout all of this was the Prince of Faerghus himself. He looked at his friends warily and slowly, not wanting to say anything that would upset them but knowing he had no other choice. He had explained all that he had heard from Rhea and Seath to the rest of the Blue Lions, and as was to be expected, they hadn't taken it well. How could anyone take news like that well? Dimitri took in a grounding breath before reiterating the point. My uncle has seized control of the capital and declared war on House Frildarius. Your father will be arriving shortly to discuss this with us so we can find a solution, he explained, directing the latter half of his explanations to Felix. All signs point to him wanting to stamp out your family's bloodline entirely. I can't believe it. Annette whispered, her eyes downcast and horrified. Why would your uncle do something like that? I'd wager it has to do with House Frildarius supporting my claim to the throne, Dimitri said. His tone was surprisingly apathetic given the situation, but everyone else knew the truth. He had shut off his emotions on the matter for the sake of keeping himself composed. He needed to lead the Blue Lions no matter what, and at the moment, that meant ignoring just how worried he was about the situation. He could dwell on that after they had found a solution that would push them forward a bit more. The bigger question is why the Grand Duke chose to launch an offensive now of all times, Ingrid remarked with a frown. I know there have been conflicts in the past, but what makes now so special that he would go so far? Whatever the reason, he must have decided to act before His Highness' coronation could take place, Sylvain remarked. As for what that means, I guess we'll just have to see. I doubt it's anything sensible. My uncle claims House Frildarius is attempting to install me as their puppet, Dimitri explained. Somehow, that only made everyone's faces twist in disgust and confusion more. As such, he issued a written appeal to the Western Lords to help him rescue me from the Duke's foul clutches. At the very least, that's how he puts it. In what cruel world would our noble house take the reins of a boor like you? Felix snorted. Why would we want to? Why would we need to? Don't ask me, Dmitri said simply. It's his pretext. So what exactly is going on in the capital? Has it really been seized like you said? Annette asked. Her face had gone pale, and as the seconds went by, she only seemed to look more sickly from worry. I hope nobody there has been met with foul play, Mercedes murmured, even though they all knew that was likely wishful thinking. If the Grand Duke was willing to declare war and march on one of the kingdom's foremost houses, then he was willing to hurt anyone who dared to stand in his way. The truth may not have been pretty, but it was accurate, and all of them knew it. He's in no position to continue the war in full until I've been removed from the situation, Dmitri said. If I had to wager a guess, I would say that he's preparing for a very quick scramble to eliminate Rodrigue from power. As for how well that will work, only time will tell. I say the regent should be dealt with before he can do something like that, Sylvain suggested. I haven't heard one good thing about his leadership. What reason would anyone have to keep him around when he just wants to hurt those under his command? I've no intention of becoming a pawn in this game, I can assure you, Dmitri announced. All the same, I must return to Fairgus at once. Didu, you will accompany me. As you wish, Your Highness, Didu said with a single firm nod. Dmitri turned his attention to Felix next. I'm sure your father will contact you soon, Felix. For now, just wait for Rodrigue to weigh in. I have no doubt my uncle will want to target you because you are the heir to House Frildarius, but I don't want you to get caught up in all of this and end up hurt. I think we're well past that point, Felix snapped back. The Grand Duke took over the capital. It's just a matter of time before this spreads to consume all of us. What are we supposed to do besides fight back? I agree with Felix, Ingrid chimed in. You can't just expect to go to the capital all on your own, Your Highness. All of us are here for you, and if you would be willing to have us, we would like to join you. We can help you to put down this rebellion. I don't want any of you to get hurt in the crossfire of this conflict, Dmitri countered with a frown. I can handle this on my own. I don't want to drag any of you. What dragging? Your uncle is going to target me too. You just said it yourself, Felix interrupted. Whether you want us involved or not, we're going to help you. What other choice do we have? What other choice do you have if you want this coup to be put down before it can bite back? Dmitri took a long moment to consider Felix's words, and the air around the blue lions seemed to grow in thickness until it was threatening to suffocate each and every one of them. Dmitri took in a careful breath before pushing it out slowly. All right, he agreed. You will all join me on the journey to Fhirdiad. We will likely be fighting against a few of the western lords in the capital though. I want you to be as careful as possible. Everyone nodded slowly, but Ash seemed the least certain out of all of them. He curled his arms around his stomach like he was trying to fend off a wave of sickness, and Didu turned to him with a frown. Ash? He questioned of the smaller boy. Ash snapped out of his trance suddenly, his eyes wide and anxiety written all over his features. I'm sorry, he blurted out. It's just that Lonato used to be in the Grand Duke's service, so I don't know if we'll have to fight against him. I hope that's not the case, but I suppose none of us can be sure until we get to the capital. If he is there, I bet we'll be able to convince him to not fight against us, Annette pointed out with a reassuring smile. He cares about you a lot, and he wouldn't want anything bad to happen to you. If you just talk to him, everything will be fine. Ash didn't seem quite so convinced, but before he could push the subject further, Dmitri continued with a strained sigh. Truth be told, we're not sure where anyone's allegiances lie at this point, he murmured. We must keep level heads and proceed with as much caution as possible. The capital awaits us for better or worse. Once Rodrigue arrives, we can begin planning our counterattack. Until then, do your best to prepare. This is one battle we cannot afford to lose. The Blue Lions nodded their understanding before scattering at that, taking off to tackle any major obstacles that stood in the way of them. The path ahead would be long, and each of them knew that. How they would address the issue had yet to be seen, but Dmitri refused to back down quite yet. He had no other choice but to fight his uncle, and he knew it. Once everyone else had departed, Dmitri let out another heavy exhale and practically collapsed into his desk's chair. He pinched at the bridge of his nose, glad to have a few moments of respite even though he knew it wouldn't last for long. He needed to catch his breath and allow his mind to catch up to the world around him for a few seconds. Of all the ways he had expected his time at the officers' academy to go, this had to be one of the least wanted outcomes on his list. It wasn't as if this was out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it was all too close to the truth, and that was perhaps the most painful part of all this. He knew his uncle would do something like this regardless of the consequences, and the truth stung. Dmitri had gotten used to his uncle's cruelty years ago, but he never quite understood what he was meant to do about it. As far as he was concerned, it was just another fact of his life, and he was far from eager to change it. Rufus was the only family Dmitri had left after the tragedy of Dusker, and he would not jump at the opportunity to eliminate his final thread of blood relation after everything else he had been through. Dmitri didn't want to do any of this. Of course he didn't want to. Still, he knew there was no other choice, and the reminder was like a punch to the stomach. For the sake of those he cared about, he would need to bite back. He had tried to sit back in compliance for years, never objecting to what his uncle did with hopes that it would all smooth itself over, though he had come to understand a long time ago that his optimism was in vain. Rufus was not a man of change, and Dmitri knew it. Rufus twisted the world around him to suit his own visions, and yet, Dmitri did not want to believe it. He had seen the truth for himself countless times, but there was always some excuse on the tip of his tongue for him to not push the subject. It was all fine. It had to be. But not anymore. Dmitri couldn't say why Rufus had decided to strike now of all times, but he wouldn't be allowing his uncle to get away with it. The damage had already been done, and Dmitri would have to finish the war before it could spread. At least he wouldn't be alone throughout all of this. He was uneasy about bringing the Blue Lions with him when they would be placed in so much danger, but he knew Felix was right about him needing more help to fight back. Dmitri was a powerful fighter, but he wouldn't be able to handle this alone. No person could handle all of this alone. Dmitri wished that wasn't the case, but he was hardly a fool. He knew what had to be done, and it went against every single thing he had ever wanted to come out of his life and his time at the officers' academy. Before Dmitri could haul himself to his feet and begin his own preparations in earnest, he heard a knock come at the door to the classroom. He glanced up, catching a glimpse of a knight of Syros. The knight offered Dmitri a bow before he spoke. "Lady Rhea wishes to speak with you once again," he explained. Dmitri nodded. "Understood." He forced himself to rise to his full height once again, ignoring the way every piece of his body and mind seemed to push back against him. He was already exhausted inside and out from just hearing about all of this, and handling it personally was going to be another matter entirely. Still, he had no other choice, so he would do as he had been commanded. Dmitri followed the knight up to the audience chamber easily, weaving through the halls of the monastery without a second thought. Going to speak with Rhea was like muscle memory at this point, though he wished that wasn't the case. Still, he couldn't just ignore the truth of his situation no matter how desperate he was to push the world away, so he just concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. Rhea and Seath stood together in the audience chamber when Dmitri arrived. They were speaking to one another in concerned, hushed tones, and even though Dmitri couldn't hear what they were saying, he knew exactly what the subject was. It was glaringly obvious no matter how much he wished that wasn't the case. "Dmitri," Rhea greeted as soon as she realized they were no longer alone. She turned to face him with a small smile. Dmitri searched for any signs of strain or worry in her eyes since the stress was already starting to wear away at his morale, but Rhea let no cracks appear in her armor. As per usual, she was perfectly composed. "I have good news regarding the attack in Fhirdiad." "Yes?" Dmitri questioned. He hoped foolishly and childishly that the information would be that Rufus had pulled his troops out and was no longer planning a coup. He was jumping to the outcome he wanted most rather than the one that would be the most realistic, and he was fully aware of that, but he wanted to hope for just a little while. He wanted all of this to be some massive mistake even though he knew that ship had already sailed and been destroyed mercilessly at sea. "We will be sending many knights of Syros with you to fight the Grand Duke," Rhea went on. I understand you lack a personal military at the moment, but we will be supplementing your forces with our own for the sake of reclaiming the capital city. Regrettably, many of the knights are already deployed on another mission elsewhere as of a few days ago, but we will send our remaining forces with you to defeat the Grand Duke, Seath chimed in. Dmitri nodded along, saying nothing about how he knew exactly what the other mission was. Edelgard and many of the other Black Eagles had gone missing, with Ferdinand having taken off to investigate even more recently. Everyone knew this was about the Empire, even if they weren't willing to say it out loud. Thank you so much for your kind aid, Dmitri said with a bow. We appreciate your generosity more than words could ever hope to express. Since its very inception, we have watched over the kingdom of Faerghus as one would their own child, Rhea went on. When its peace is threatened, the Church has no choice but to act. And now, we will do all that we can to ensure that peace is restored to your homeland as soon as possible. Thank you, Dmitri repeated. I have not forgotten your outpouring of aid after my father's passing 4 years ago. I swear to repay that kindness in full, and I will do the same for the help you have offered here. Once I have been crowned king, I will do all that I can to ensure our debts to you are settled. Rhea offered Dmitri a smile, not denying his debts since there was no way anyone could deny it. The kingdom owed the Church, and everyone knew it. In the meantime, the Duke of House Frildarius will be arriving shortly, she explained. You will be free to march on the capital within the next day. We will finish our preparations at once, Dmitri assured her. Thank you again for all that you have done. Rhea just continued to smile. You are welcome, Dmitri. Annette was stressed, and as far as she was aware, she was doing a great job of hiding it. Ever since she heard about the conflict between Rodrigue, Rufus, and the Western Lords, she had been running around the monastery in a daze she couldn't even begin to articulate to others. She wanted to do as much as she could to help Dmitri, but she couldn't quite bring herself to focus only on the situation at hand no matter how hard she tried. If she didn't acknowledge it, then it couldn't hurt her. Or, at the very least, that was what she was telling herself. Annette had done just about everything she could have for the sake of the other Blue Lions, and she had carried all their burdens with a smile on her face and a spring in her step. Sure, her glee was primarily the byproduct of an adrenaline rush that refused to fade, but that was fine. She was doing what she had to in order to help out. Everyone needed her. Annette let out a sigh as she sat down in her room, one foot bouncing wildly on the spot. She wanted to find a way to calm down, but she couldn't ever convince her nerves to follow her desires. She wouldn't be of any use to anyone if she was this stressed all the time. There was only so much she could do to help when she was caught up in her own anxieties, and she had already exhausted every avenue of distraction offered to her. There was nothing else she could help with, and the brutality of that truth made her feel like she was going to be sick. But she was fine. As long as she could convince everyone else that she was okay, then everything would be fine. It just had to be. Annette's mind kept going back to her uncle no matter how hard she tried to keep herself focused though. He was surrounded by Western Lords because of Dominic's location in the western half of Faerghus. If she decided to fight against Rufus to suppress the rebellion, then she risked putting him in danger. Annette couldn't put other people at risk. She was smarter than that. But even if she knew she couldn't fight, she wanted to do something to help her friends. Dmitri was struggling, and Felix was grappling with the sudden declaration of war against his house. Everyone had some demon or another they were fighting at the moment, and Annette had to be there for them. They were all housemates, after all, and what kind of friend would Annette be if she just sat back while they were suffering? She couldn't do that. It was too much. She would figure out a solution soon enough though, right? Everyone else was counting on her, and she would find a way to make all of this come together in the end. Annette would do what she could for her friends, and she would keep her uncle out of danger too. Everything would be fine. Even if all of this ended with a coup, it would be okay. It just had to be. Annette was stressed, and as far as Ash was concerned, she was doing a horrible job of hiding it. He had been keeping an eye on her ever since the news came out about the war Rufus had declared against House Frildarius. In many ways, the other nobles of Faerghus had gotten lucky. Only Ash and Annette had to worry about fighting against those they cared for on account of both House Dominic and Lonato coming from the western regions of the kingdom. The families of the other Blue Lions were all loyal to House Frildarius, and more importantly, Dimitri. They had nothing to fear. Their families would fight on the same side as them if they joined the conflicts at all. Ash was jealous. He would never admit it, but he wished there was a way for him to be that lucky. It wasn't meant to be though, and so, he instead turned his attention to Annette. She was trying her best to hide how worried she was by smiling a bit too much and tripping over herself to help anyone who asked for it, but Ash could tell there was a lot more to it than that. Annette needed a break more than anything, but unfortunately, she wouldn't be able to find one for quite some time. The impending battle in the capital made sure of that bitter truth. Ash had never been to Annette's room, but he decided to break that streak today. He let out a careful sigh before knocking on her door. For a few seconds, everything was quiet, and Ash wondered if she was even in there at all. His answer came a few moments later when Annette weakly called out for him to come in. She had been so distracted when she came back to her room that she had forgotten to lock the door, something Ash soon learned for himself when he turned the knob and walked inside. Annette was standing at the center of the room, her desk chair pushed slightly askew and her arms pressed together behind her back. She was trying too hard to make it seem as if she was fine, and as a result, she wasn't fooling anyone. "Hey there, Ash!" Annette exclaimed. Her grin was a bit too bright, and Ash couldn't help but think of it as forced. In fact, he didn't think he had ever seen something look quite that falsified before, and that was saying a lot. "Good afternoon, Annette," Ash said in return. "Do you mind if I come in for a little bit? I was hoping to talk to you about the news from the capital." Annette's smile faltered, and Ash noticed a twitch near her eye from some blend of exhaustion and falsification. "Sure," she agreed, her voice just a little too loud. She may have thought she had everything put together, but she wasn't fooling anyone who knew her even remotely well, and Ash fell into that category seamlessly. Ash closed the door behind himself before taking a few steps toward Annette. "How have you been feeling?" he asked. "I know the idea of having to fight your family must be difficult." I don't think that's going to happen," Annette said, not even bothering to hide what was bothering her when it was brought up. Her exhaustion was blatant, and when it was pushed, she couldn't keep it masked. I don't want anything bad to happen to my uncle. He's surrounded by a bunch of other Western lords, and if I fight with the rest of you guys, they could take that as a betrayal. I don't think he would want to fight alongside the Grand Duke, but it's complicated. It seems like politics always are," Ash hummed. He hesitated before speaking once more. "I'm afraid of having to fight against Lonato. He never spoke with me much about his thoughts regarding politics, but I know he used to work with the Grand Duke. I don't want to think that he would ally himself with the regent if it came to blows, but I don't know." "You're scared, huh?" Annette questioned, and Ash took a long moment to consider it before realizing there was nothing to contemplate at all. He nodded, the motion stiff and subtle. "I guess this situation sucks for all of us. Just in different ways." "That's certainly one way of putting it," Ash agreed with a dark laugh. Each time he was left in the silence for too long, his mind would go right back to Lonato, and he had no idea how to handle it. Ash wished for a moment that he had asked more questions about what his adoptive father thought of politics and how he would respond in a situation like this. He had no way of knowing something like this was coming, yes, but Ash still desperately wished there was a way he could have known more. The uncertainty was debilitating and overwhelming. Annette and Ash remained there in the silence together for a few long moments before the mage let out a long sigh. "I'm scared too," she confessed. "It feels so weird to say, but we're supposed to just be students. I know we were told to expect to go on missions for the church every month, but this feels different somehow. We're going off to put down a coup in the morning. The Grand Duke of the Kingdom has revealed himself to be a traitor, and we just have to deal with it. We have to fight through it." "I don't get it." "It's a lot to take in," Ash agreed. "I never thought this was how our first major mission would go. Our previous scuffle was so much smaller than this, and now, it feels like we're on the brink of war. It feels like the whole world is ending," Annette confessed. She sat gracelessly on her bed, pressing her hands against her eyes hard enough to make stars explode against her darkened vision. The knights are often the Empire trying to handle some battle or another that we don't get to hear about. All of this is happening right after someone who works at the church was revealed to be a traitor. I thought I was coming here for a regular school experience, but instead, everything just keeps getting more intense. We're still students. I thought I wouldn't have to worry about this stuff until I got older and had graduated. Ash looked over to Annette and watched as she let out another staggered breath. She had fallen backward onto the mattress, leaving her legs dangling off the side while her torso faced the ceiling. Annette was getting overwhelmed, but she would never dare to admit it. Tears were starting to well in her eyes against her will, not that she would confess to their presence. Ash could see the truth though, and he sat down beside her on her bed. "Nobody will blame you if you decide you don't want to come," Ash murmured. "I know this is a lot for you to take in, and if you need a break." "I can't do that," Annette cut in before he had the chance to finish. "Everyone is already having an awful time, and I don't want to hold them back just because I got too caught up in my own head. I want to help everyone. I want to make things right, but I don't know how to do that right now. It's just so much to take in." "It is," Ash agreed. "I'm nervous about fighting against Lonato too. I have to wonder if it would be best if I stayed behind too." That changed Annette's tune entirely, and she finally pulled her hands away from her eyes to stare at him. Redness was starting to tear at the skin near her eyes, but she said nothing about it. You were thinking of staying behind?" she asked. Ash nodded. "Lonato would want me to make the choice that's best for me. For a while, I was thinking that would mean fighting with everyone else. But the more I think about that, the more it scares me," he confessed. "I don't want to have to fight my family over something like this." "You're right when you say that this situation is bad. If we're not careful, it could easily lead to a civil war." "It already has," Annette pointed out. "And for some reason, students have been left to clean up the messes because nobody else knows how to step up and fix it. Nobody is going to hold it against you if you decide you need to take a step back," Ash assured her. "Do what you think is best for you. If that means you need to take a break, then that's okay. I think I'm going to stay at the monastery until all of this smooths over. I may not be a noble child by blood, but I am related to Lonato, and if I fight here, then it could cause issues for him as well." Annette remained quiet for a long time before she looked over at him with exhausted, worried eyes. "You really think it would be okay if we stayed behind?" she asked softly. "I believe His Highness would trust us to make the best decisions for ourselves," Ash told her. "And if that means we have to stay behind while he is concentrating on the battle at hand, then I think he'll respect that. This isn't a battle we should need to fight." "You're right when you say that. And maybe it's for the best if we don't fight it." Annette looked up at the ceiling for another few moments, and Ash was left wondering if she was even going to answer him at all. "I think I want to stay behind," she admitted. "And if you're going to stay here, then I guess we can just make the most of this together." She gave him a shaky smile at that, and even though she was still pushing herself, she wasn't going as far as she had when he first walked in. She had needed this conversation just as much as Ash, and he was more than happy to share it with her. "That sounds like a plan I can get behind," Ash smiled. He extended a hand to her, and Annette happily accepted it as he helped her to sit up. There was still a lot they didn't understand and many questions they had yet to iron out, but this was enough for the time being. The rest of the Blue Lions could handle the battle in the capital, and after all was said and done, Ash and Annette could hear about their many adventures and battles against Rufus' forces. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would work for the two of them, and that was all that really mattered. Check the description for the links to the author.